Marie Antoinette, the Austrian princess who became a French queen, is best known for being beheaded by Madame Guillotine during the French Revolution in 1793. Famous for her fashions, love of the arts, and alleged decadence in the face of France's poverty, she is less well known as a mother. Not only giving birth to 4 of her children, she also adopted 4 more. But what happened to the 8 forgotten children of the French king and queen? Marie Antoinette was married by proxy on the 19th of April, 1770, to Louis Auguste, the Dauphin of France. Their marriage was the result of an end to hostilities between Austria and France, when Empress Maria Theresa of Austria agreed to a match for her daughter with Louis XV of France's eldest grandson. It was hoped their union would strengthen both countries against Great Britain and Prussia. Marie Antoinette was only 14, but on the 14th of May she set out for the edge of the forest of Compiègne, where she was to meet her future husband for the first time, who was also just 15. Just 2 days later, the young couple were married in person at the Palace of Versailles, and as was typical for royal marriages at the time, was followed by the ritual bedding. The couple were tucked in together in the hopes they would consummate their marriage. However, this didn't happen, and wouldn't happen for several years afterwards. There are many theories around why this occurred, ranging from being so young when they were married, a lack of interest and understanding of sex, to a possible penile condition Louis may have had. Whatever the reason, it damaged the reputation of the couple well into their becoming the King and Queen of France in 1774. They wouldn't have their first biological child until another 3 years had gone by, and Marie Antoinette's desire for a child reportedly led to the very odd and difficult story of their first adopted son. One day in 1776, Marie Antoinette was out for a carriage ride with her ladies-in-waiting when they went past a small village near Louveciennes. There was a sudden jolt as the carriage came to a sharp stop. Outside, 5-year-old François Michel Gagné had run out in front onto the road, narrowly avoiding an accident. The carriage was immediately stopped, and the coachman jumped down to check on the child, thankfully finding him unhurt. His grandmother flung open her cottage door, flying across to her grandson. But before she got to François Michel, the Queen herself came down from her seat. With her arms held out, Marie Antoinette cried out that the child was hers, that destiny had handed him to her to console her until she gave birth to a child of her own. The Queen pressed on, asking if his mother was still alive. His grandmother replied, "No, madame, my daughter died last winter and left 5 small children upon my hands." Marie Antoinette then asked if the elderly woman would agree to allowing her to adopt her young grandson, also promising to financially take care of his siblings. The grandmother agreed. This may seem heartless, but for an old woman with at least 4 or 5 orphan children to take care of in rural 18th century France, the Queen offering to pay for them and bring one up at court was like winning the lottery. This came about in later years, with his brother being able to have an education in music, and dowries and monetary gifts being given to François Michel's 2 sisters. Not surprisingly, the little boy was not happy with this arrangement, and as the carriage drove off, he showed his displeasure by screaming and kicking the Queen and her ladies. It set the tone for his future relationship with the royal family. From the start, François Michel missed his biological family. It wasn't unusual for wealthy families to foster more impoverished children, but this was unusual in that Marie Antoinette gave François Michel a new name, Armand, and he became, if not part of court life, part of the private family life of the French royals. In the absence of giving birth to any biological children, The little boy apparently brought the queen a lot of joy. However, once she gave birth to her first daughter in 1778, she reportedly lost interest in François Michel. He was never happy in his life at the palace, and as a result, the relationship between the boy and his adoptive parents was always miserable and broken. It was no surprise then that when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, he came to have Republican sympathies and joined the Revolutionaries. He was sadly killed just a few years later at the Battle of Jemappes in 1792. But he was far from their only child. Finally, in 1778, Marie Antoinette gave birth to the first royal child, Marie-Therese. Her birth was a difficult one, but when she finally came into the world, she was greeted by her mother with great delight. It was reported that the Queen said, "Poor little one, you are not desired, but you will be none the less dear to me. A son would have belonged to the state. You will belong to me." Contrary to Marie Antoinette's later image of a materialistic queen who ignored the plight of the poor, she apparently wanted to bring her daughter up to be more in touch with normal people. She often invited children of lower social ranks to eat with Marie-Therese and encouraged her daughter to give her toys away to the poor. Apparently, Louis XVI was very affectionate and loving as a father and often indulged his daughter. She had a happy childhood until the French Revolution began. Attacks on her mother increased. A mixture of xenophobia within the French court against her Austrian roots and political propaganda used to explain the weakened French economy. Things seemed for a while to be all right until the Bastille was stormed on the 14th of July 1789. Things began to move fast after that. On the 5th of October, a group of working-class women marched to Versailles and stormed the palace, intent on taking food they had heard was stored there. The royal family was forced to take refuge in the king's apartments, later being moved by the demands of the crowd to Tuileries Palace. An escape plan was formed which would have allowed the family to escape to a royalist stronghold in northeastern France, but they were cut off and forced back to Paris. On the 13th of August, 1792, the whole family were imprisoned in the Tour du Temple, the remains of a medieval castle. It must have been terrifying for Marie-Therese and her parents. She was just 10 years old. A few months later, her father was taken from the tower and she never saw him again. He was executed by guillotine on the 21st of January 1793. Marie-Therese was left with her mother, Marie Antoinette, her aunt, Madame Elizabeth, younger sister of the deceased king, and her younger brother, Louis Charles, who had been declared Louis XVII by royalist supporters. This support meant that 6 months later, on the 3rd of July, revolutionaries came and removed Louis from his family, entrusting him to the care of a cobbler called Antoine Simon. The 3 women left of the family tried to stop them, crying out and reaching for him, but it was no use. On the 2nd of August, Marie Antoinette was taken away to meet her fate, and was followed by Madame Elizabeth, who was executed on the 10th of May 1794. Marie-Therese was now left alone. However, she still didn't know her mother and aunt were dead until over a year later in August 1795, when she was finally told about what had happened to them. Her grief was immense. She didn't escape the horror of her situation until the 18th of December 1795, on the eve of her 17th birthday. She was finally able to go to Vienna, where her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Francis II, lived, but her anguish was far from over. After marrying her cousin, Louis Antoine, Duc d'Angoulême, in June 1799, the couple moved to Buckinghamshire in Britain, to Hartwell House. The couple, although they had no children, were reportedly happy enough, and Britain was a welcoming place for the French royals. However, it was still exile, and Marie-Therese must have felt a mixture of longing for the home she had lost and dealing with the grief those memories of the past brought. Finally, in 1814, with the abdication of Napoleon Bonaparte, her long years of exile were over, and Marie-Therese returned to France with her husband Louis-Antoine by her side and her uncle Louis XVIII. But understandably, it was a difficult return. She didn't trust anyone who had supported the Republic under Napoleon, and many young men came forward claiming to be her long-dead brother Louis Charles. This caused her much distress, despite her uncle's attempts to prevent them coming forward. The Bourbon Restoration, as the return of the royal family was known, was briefly interrupted a year later in 1815 by the 100 Days. This was an attempt by Napoleon to regain control of France, but it ultimately failed, and the restoration continued afterwards until 1830. Her father-in-law was by this time on the throne as Charles X, and his ultra-royalist ideals had alienated the royals once more from ordinary working people. He was forced to abdicate on the 2nd of August, followed by his son Louis-Antoine, who was arguably King of France in the 20 minutes between his father's abdication and his own. Therefore, Marie-Therese was Queen of France for those 20 minutes. But it was soon over, and they were once again in exile, fleeing to Britain. After years of living between relatives' homes in Europe, outliving her husband, Marie-Therese died of pneumonia on the 19th of October 1851 at the age of 83. Hers had been a long and sad life, with moments of happiness and memories of people who had long since passed in the name of France. On her grave, she is remembered as Queen Dowager of France, a reference to her brief queenship. But she was not an only child, and the first of her 2 biological brothers, Louis Joseph, was born at the Palace of Versailles on the 22nd of October 1781. As France at that time barred women from holding the throne, Louis Joseph was hailed as the Dauphin of France, the heir to the French crown. His birth was therefore met with great joy, and he was close to his parents and sister, much loved by them all. He was apparently a happy and intelligent child, but it soon became clear that he had weak health. When he was only 3 years old, Louis Joseph suddenly became ill with a series of fevers. Fearful for the young Dauphin's health, the little boy was quickly transported to Château de la Motte, a royal residence on the edge of Paris. He recovered to the relief of everyone, and just a year later in 1785, he was inoculated against smallpox and sent to rest at the chateau once more. In 1786, the fevers returned again, but this time the royal household ignored the fevers. It was around this time the young prince was also noted to walk with some difficulty, which was due to a curved spine. This was treated with a metal corset, but 2 years later in 1788, his fevers increased. This was a symptom of tuberculosis, but still no one understood what was really wrong. On the 4th of June, 1789, Louis Joseph of France died. He was still a child, only 7 years old, and his death devastated his family. His wet nurse, Geneviève Barbier, was accused retrospectively of transmitting the disease to the Dauphin through her milk. His death came just as the Estates General that led to the French Revolution were convened, and must have been an ill omen of more sadness yet to come. When Louis Joseph died, his title of Dauphin of France passed to his younger brother Louis Charles, who was born in March 1785. Louis Charles's upbringing, like that of his siblings, was as expected for a royal child. He was looked after by a governess and a royal household, and his mother and father doted on him as much as their other children. But there were ugly rumours at court that he was in fact an illegitimate son of Marie Antoinette and Axel von Fersen, a Swedish count she was thought to be romantically involved with. Most modern historians dispute this, as there is little evidence, and Marie Antoinette was unlikely to have made her position at court more difficult against her enemies. After his family was moved to the Tuileries Palace in 1789, life became much more strained and less private for them all. Louis Charles's mother was only permitted to see her two children with guards, and her hands kept behind her back at all times. All three of them would be searched for letters smuggled between them. However, things were to get much worse. In 1792, when the family were taken to Temple Tower, it wouldn't be long before Louis Charles found himself removed from them. With the death of his father, royalists intent on restoring the French royals named him Louis XVII. This made him a threat in the eyes of the Revolutionaries, and on the 11th of December, he was taken away from his family. It would be the last time he ever saw them. He was placed into the hands of Antoine Simon, a cobbler who had been named as his guardian. While there is little proof for them, stories written by royalists started to circulate of the ill treatment of the young boy. However, Marie-Therese later wrote in her memoirs and stated that Antoine was the monster Simon, suggesting there was at least some truth to them. Foreign secretaries in both Britain and Spain had spies report back with horrific accounts that the young prince had been raped by prostitutes in order to infect him with sexually transmitted diseases to create fake evidence against the Queen. Other accounts, including the memoirs written by his older sister Marie-Therese, stated that he was beaten and physically abused by his jailers. On the 6th of October, French politicians and other supporters visited the boy and secured a signature from him, condemning his mother and aunt with charges of sexual child abuse. The poor boy's mental state can only be imagined. However, visitors to the prison never reported seeing any of this, but a planned visit might have meant the visitors didn't see the truth. And the truth becomes even more difficult to find after this point, as many records for this period were lost. Restoration historians would later tell a story of how Louis Charles was kept in a filthy dark room with bars, only being passed food through them to survive. No one entered his room for 6 months. Paul Barras, a French politician, visited after the 27th of July 1794, and while he claimed the boy was suffering from neglect, he made no mention of a dark, dirty room with bars. The reality is probably somewhere in between both stories. It's likely Louis Charles was kept imprisoned in a room of some kind, but there's no reason to believe he would have been intentionally starved or left in a filthy room, as there is no proof of it. The one thing that was true was Louis Charles's silence. Since the day he had signed the document accusing his mother and aunt of abuse, the young boy had remained mute. Early in 1795, Louis Charles fell ill. Physicians were called for, but on the 8th of June, the young boy's life finally came to an end. He was only 10 years old. A French surgeon who was called to do the autopsy, Philippe Jean Pelletan, stated that the prince had died of tuberculosis. The surgeon also removed and smuggled out Louis Charles's heart, following a tradition of preserving the hearts of French royalty. This heart passed through various hands in a dried state until it was finally interred in the Saint Denis Basilica on the 8th of June 2004. As for Louis Charles's final resting place, it was unmarked, his remains buried at Sainte Marguerite Cemetery on the 10th of June. Marie Antoinette's final biological child was Sophie Helena Beatrice, born on the 9th of July, 1786. Sadly, hers is a very short tale, as she did not live long enough to see out her first year of life. The little girl was born a good size and healthy, but she contracted an illness which also plagued her two older brothers, tuberculosis. At just 11 months old, after suffering nearly a week of convulsions, the young princess died on the 19th of June, 1787. When someone tried to console Marie Antoinette that she had not known her child long, and therefore could not be as deeply attached to her, the French queen responded, "Don't forget that she would have been my friend." It was obvious that, like most mothers, Marie Antoinette loved her children. But this was not the end to the French king and queen's children. In 1787, the French official Chevalier de Boufflers came to court with a gift for the queen, a parrot and a young boy from French Senegal who had been enslaved by de Boufflers, called Jeanne Amilcar. Not much is known about Jeanne's life before this point, except that he was born around 1781, so was only 6 years old when he was presented at the French court. Marie Antoinette immediately manumitted the small boy, arranging for him to be baptized, and he was officially adopted by the French king and queen as their foster son. It was expected of the royal couple to take on foster children as part of their duties, but unlike his other foster siblings, Jeanne was not raised at court. The queen instead arranged a place for him in a boarding school in Saint-Cloud, paying for him even as the French Revolution continued, only stopping after her imprisonment, when she could no longer afford to pay for him. Why he was not raised at court alongside his other siblings raises obvious questions about racism. But many of the older siblings of Marie Antoinette's other adopted children also didn't live at court. The true reasons are unknown, but after she was unable to keep paying the fees for Jeanne's boarding school, he was expelled. It was thought for many years that the poor boy was simply turned out into the street and starved to death. However, later research has shown this not to be true, that in fact, Jeanne was taken in by one of his tutors, Quentin Belden. We know this as Belden applied to the French government for a grant to cover Jeanne's schooling, one that was for people who had been enslaved before the Revolution. He was apparently skilled enough as an artist to be enrolled at the Liancourt Academy in Paris in 1796, with government support once more. However, he sadly died at a hospital in Paris later that same year, and he then disappears from the historical record. Marie Antoinette's third adopted child actually lived at Versailles long before she got royal adoptive parents. Born Marie Philippine Labriquet, later given the name Ernestine by Marie Antoinette, the young girl was born on the 31st of July 1778 to Jacques Lambriquet and Marie Philippine Noiret. Her father was a servant to the Comte de Provence, the king's brother, and her mother was a chambermaid. While Ernestine was still a very small child, she was chosen to be the playmate and companion of Marie Therese, spending her days with her royal friend and returning to her family at night. This was a common custom at the time, to allow royal or noble children a playmate of a lower social level than themselves, as it was thought to teach humility. For the poorer families, they probably had little say in the matter, and might have been paid extra, which would help bring up their other children. Rumours at court once again abounded, but this time of Louis XVI. Ernestine was said to bear a strong resemblance to the French king, and so there were whispers that she was in fact his secret illegitimate child. This only came about as she had a passing resemblance to Marie Therese. Her daily life was very similar to that of the princess. Marie Antoinette gave orders that the two girls should be dressed the same, and when they ate dinner, one should be served before the other on alternating days. Ernestine even received the same education as Marie Therese, and the governesses, along with all the other household staff, were told to treat the girls as equals in private. Some time before 1788, Ernestine's mother died. Despite her father still being alive, Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI formally adopted Ernestine as their daughter on the 9th of November of that year. She was awarded a pension of 12,000 livres by the king, and was in private the same as her other brothers and sisters. However, she was never given a formal rank or treated as a royal daughter in public, and at court was simply known as Marie-Thérese's playmate. She also had 2 biological siblings who were fostered by the royal family, but only in the form of financial aid, and they never lived with them as Ernestine did. When the revolution broke out, Ernestine travelled with the family to Tuileries Palace. She remained there until 1791, when she was sent to her biological father, who was safely in the countryside until the royal family's escape plan failed, and they were sent back to Paris, where she rejoined them. There is a story that on the 10th of August 1792, Marie Antoinette ordered the royal governess, Renée Suzanne de Soucy, to take Ernestine to safety and look after her. As de Soucy raced outside the palace to fetch a carriage, leaving Ernestine stood alone for a moment, a passing rebel mistook Ernestine for Marie-Thérèse. He threw the corpse of a member of the Swiss Guard at her feet, but a nearby shopkeeper defended her, chasing off the rebel, ironically because he also believed her to be Marie-Thérèse. During the terror of what came afterwards, Ernestine was looked after by de Soucy's father and his family. Her biological father, Jacques, was arrested and later executed on the 9th of July 1794 for his connection to the royal family. Little is known about Ernestine's life after this point. On the 2nd of September 1796, she was finally old enough to no longer need guardians and was permitted to live alone and sort her own affairs. On the 7th of December 1810, she finally found some happiness of her own when she married a widower called Jean-Charles Germain Prépin under her birth name of Marie-Philippine Lambriquet. It's unknown whether she chose to use this name because she wanted to cast off her adoptive name and the memories that came with it, or if it was simply safer to do so. Sadly, her happiness didn't last long, and she died on the 30th of December 1813 in Saint-Denis, aged just 35 of unknown causes. Her resemblance to Marie-Thérèse, however, abounded in rumours that the 2 girls had switched at some point, and that the Marie-Thérèse who was now part of the Bourbon Restoration was in fact Ernestine. And the real Marie-Thérèse had supposedly disappeared into Hildburghausen in Germany. There, she was known by locals as the Dark Countess, only went out with a veil over her face and hardly spoke. When she died, she was hurriedly buried. However, DNA testing in 2013 on the body of the Dark Countess proved that this story was untrue. The final child Marie Antoinette adopted was yet another playmate, this time for Louis Charles. Her name was Jeanne-Louise Victoire, and she was born in 1787 to an usher within the royal household, and also had 2 older siblings. In 1790, despite the uncertainty of the royal family's future, Marie Antoinette adopted Jeanne and her 2 siblings when she heard that their parents had died within just a few months of each other. Her 2 older sisters were sent to a convent with all their expenses paid, but Jeanne was kept at court to be a playmate to Louis Charles and given the name Zoe. Just 2 years later, when Zoe was 5, she was sent to join her sisters at their convent just before the French royals attempted to escape during the flight to Varennes in 1791. As with Jean Hamilcar, the expenses for the children ceased when Marie Antoinette was imprisoned, and nothing further is known about their fate. It can only be hoped that someone was kind enough to take them in. Despite Marie Antoinette's image after the French Revolution, she was really no worse or better than any other queen from Europe's courts. But she obviously had a big heart and was a mother to many children, not merely those she gave birth to. Sadly, many of her children died young, some of them after years of anguish or imprisonment, some of them violently, but their stories are testament to the caring family the French Queen attempted to create for them all. Madame du Barry, better known as the scandalous mistress of Louis XV, ended her life, like many others in 18th century revolutionary France, under the blade of the guillotine. But how did she end up there? And where did Madame du Barry come from? She was born Jeanne Bécu on the 19th of August 1743 in Vaucouleurs, a commune in northeastern France. Her mother was Anne Bécu, a 30-year-old seamstress who was unmarried, making Jeanne illegitimate. While her father is unknown, there were rumours that he was a friar known as Jean-Jacques Gaumard de Vaubernier, a shocking fact if it was true. Not much is known about Madame du Barry's childhood, but when she was around 3 years old, her mother made the acquaintance of a Monsieur Billiard de Monceau, a financier and supplier to the Royal Army of France who lived in Paris. Anne Bécu and her young daughter moved to Paris, and both were placed in the household of his mistress, with Anne working as a cook. There were further rumours that Monsieur Billiard de Monceau was a brief lover of Anne's, and was father to Jeanne's half-brother Claude. De Monceau's mistress Francesca apparently adored little Jeanne, spoiling her and lavishing attention and fine clothes on her. This would be the first chance she was given to understand she had the power to capture people's attention. Francesca would show her off to visitors, dancing and entertaining them. Her mother was shut away in the kitchen, however, and de Monceau's visits became less and less as Francesca kept a sharp eye on him, until at last Anne listened to an older sister who suggested marriage. The possible future husband was Nicolas Rinson, 10 years her junior and pockmarked, but earning a good income. He was made more attractive when de Monceau appointed him as a storekeeper to the army, and the two were married when Jeanne was about 6 years old. It was decided she should be given an education, and Francesca suggested a convent school for wayward girls, run by the nuns of Saint-Ours. This was not a fashionable convent for the wealthy, as the girls here were taught mainly domestic subjects and religious instruction. However, both music and drawing were also taught, and Jeanne developed a love of drawing, which would last with her into adult life when she later became a patron of the arts. She remained at the convent until she was 15 years old. Now she needed to find a form of income to support herself and her mother, as her stepfather was away in Corsica. However, Jeanne's family were all too aware of the dangers awaiting a pretty face in Paris, and a job was soon found to keep her busy. Again her aunt, Hélène Bécu, came to the rescue with employment as a young hairdresser's apprentice. By the end of 1758, Jeanne not only had a job she was perfect for, but Lamette, the young hairdresser, had fallen head over heels in love with her. While there was no mention of marriage, he was happy to welcome Jeanne into his luxurious apartment and shower her with money and gifts, at least until his mother found out and declared an end to the whole affair. Madame Lamette was furious that her son had squandered his income on a working-class slip of a girl, and an end was put to the affair. Her next work was as a lady's maid to an elderly lady, a Madame de la Garde. but it wasn't long before the old lady was just as charmed with her pretty new maid as everyone else was, and Jeanne became her companion. Society people who hadn't visited much in recent years suddenly came more often, and Madame de la Garde's two sons' visits also became more frequent. It wasn't long before the two men, unhappy in their marriages, found themselves equally infatuated with their mother's new companion. Jeanne was happy to receive their gifts and attentions, but once again, the elderly lady was unhappy to find this situation, and the future Madame du Barry was once more without work. But Jeanne had made the acquaintance of many wealthy and admiring men, and it wasn't long before she was once more employed in their midst. This time as a milliner's assistant in à la toilette, one of the most exclusive fashion houses in Paris. It was run by Monsieur Labille, father to the artist Adelaide Labille-Guiard, who became good friends with Jeanne Bécu. She thrived in the shop as the centre of attention, gaining gifts from rich bankers, merchants and minor nobility alike, who fell for her slanting violet blue eyes and golden ringlets of hair. She was never happy to accept the offers of becoming mistress to one man, however, always searching for luxury in higher quarters. But it was in 1763 that the definitive moment that was to set the path for Madame du Barry came. Jeanne was now going by the surname Vaubernier, a nod to the rumours of her possible monk father. She and Adelaide Labille were invited to view the unveiling of a new equestrian statue of King Louis XV. The statue was viewed somewhat mockingly, as the once beloved king was becoming despised by his subjects, thanks to the loss of Canada to Britain and constant wars on behalf of Empress Maria Theresa and the Austrian alliance. Nevertheless, it was a grand spectacle to celebrate the unveiling, with fireworks, mock battles on the Seine, and meat handed out to the poor. It was there she caught the eye of Jean-Baptiste du Barry, a minor noble from Toulouse. He was from an impoverished military family, but had come to Paris after leaving his wife and baby son behind at his country chateau, and was now so renowned as a card sharp and seducer of women that he earned the nickname Le Roux, the Rake. He had made some lucrative deals with army contracts, but his real income came from his ability to find and procure pretty young women, ranging from shop girls to little-known actresses. In short, Du Barry worked as a pimp for the wealthy and well-to-do of Paris. Quickly making the acquaintance of Jeanne, it wasn't long before she was installed in his household. In the first few months, Jean-Baptiste du Barry was so infatuated with his new young mistress that Jeanne entered the world of the courtesan, showered with jewels and fine clothes. Her mother now dressed in silks and had her own servants, and her stepfather was given a lucrative promotion. But the spell was broken when Du Barry's 14-year-old son arrived in Paris. He was quieter than his father, but instantly liked by Jeanne, who welcomed him with open arms. Du Barry wanted to gain a place at Versailles for his shy son, and he managed it through his friendship with the 70-year-old Duc de Richelieu, who was disliked by many but loved by the king. In exchange for his son's position, Jeanne was sold to the Duke, being given 1,200 livres for her compliance, around £20,000 today. The old man protected her from her first day at court, and for her part, Jeanne remained loyal to him his whole life. However, Mademoiselle Vaubernier, as she was now officially called, also remained at Du Barry's side, appearing at his dinners and encouraging her admirers to lose their money in his gambling rooms. In 1768, Jeanne visited Versailles, sent to see the most powerful man in France at that time, the Duc de Choiseul. Du Barry held a contract to supply arms to Corsica, and he had handed the revenues from this to Jeanne, but only because the Duc de Choiseul, aware of the abuses of these contracts, was putting them to an end. In hopes of keeping it, Jeanne had to plead it was her only income. Du Barry, hoping Choiseul would be bowled over by a pretty face. He wasn't, and Jeanne was sent away. But as she was leaving and passing through the state apartments, Providence would step in. The Queen of France was dying, and Mass was being said for her every day, to which King Louis XV attended. As he passed through the gallery of mirrors on his way, he happened to look up from his melancholy grief and met the gaze of Jeanne's blue eyes, and she dared to smile at him. It wasn't long before the king obtained her identity with the help of Dominique Guillaume Lebel, who was his personal valet, but also his procurer. There is a story that upon Jeanne's first meeting with the king, she performed the expected 3 curtsies, then walked up and kissed him full on the lips. This story is likely not true, but it is an example of how besotted the king became with her. No one told him of her true origins. She was instead passed off as a married woman who had a few liaisons at court. This was fine for a passing fling, but it became a worry for the king's valet as Louis became more enamoured. On the 24th of June, 1768, Queen Maria passed away. It was none but Jeanne who was able to lift the king from his grief. Louis XV had grown closer to his queen in his later years after Madame Pompadour, his most famous mistress, became only his friend, and without her by his side, having also lost several of his children to death over the last decade, Louis was a man searching for something to make him feel happy once more. Lebel had no choice but to tell the king the truth. The king was furious with his valet, and ordered him to at once arrange a marriage for his new lover that would supply her with the necessary title for a mistress of the king. In order to be maîtresse en titre, or official mistress of the king, Jeanne needed to be both married and a member of the nobility. Jean-Baptiste du Barry would have married her himself, had he not already been married to a long-suffering wife, and so he suggested his brother, Guillaume de Barry. Guillaume was short, fat, and liked drinking, but had been invalided out of the army and was unlikely to have other marriage prospects. He was persuaded to become the husband of a woman whose bed he would never share by a large sum of money from his brother and the contrivance of the Duc de Richelieu. On the 1st of September that year, the wedding took place, with the aid of a false birth certificate stating Jeanne was of noble descent. She was installed above the king's chambers, but now led a lonely life. Due to the protocol of the French court, Louis was unable to be seen in public with her, as she had not yet been presented at court. Despite attempts to button down her past, the court was full of whispers about the girl who had been plucked from the streets and installed as the king's mistress, and none of the noblewomen dared to put themselves forward as her patron, revolted that a commoner should dare to converse with them and aspire to their position. The king demanded a patron be found, and again with the Duc de Richelieu's help, Madame de Berne was put forward. She was encouraged to take the position by having her huge gambling debts paid off. It took 3 attempts before the presentation was successful, however. The first time, Madame de Berne grew nervous and feigned a sprained ankle. On the second occasion, Louis was hurt by falling from a horse and breaking his arm. But at last, on the 22nd of April 1769, Jeanne was presented at the court at Versailles as Madame du Barry. She wore a silver-white gown threaded with gold, bedecked with jewels sent the night before from the king, and her coiffure was so spectacular it was the cause of her being late. She now also had a companion, her sister-in-law, Claire Françoise. Jean-Baptiste had arranged for his sister to join Jeanne, as his sister was not renowned for her looks or dowry, but was witty and clever, and the two women aided one another in the protocols and rituals of the new world Madame du Barry found herself in. Madame du Barry soon settled into her new life, finally enjoying the endless luxury she had always craved. Louis XV gave her a young Bengali slave named Zamore. Jeanne took a liking to Zamore and provided him with elegant clothes and an education. She was brought hot chocolate in bed every morning, dressed in fine gowns and jewellery, and had her hair done by professional hairdressers. She would then receive visitors, artists and jewellers who hoped that she would buy something of their new stock. Jeanne had always loved art since her days drawing in the convent, and now she used her new riches to become patron to many artists. She even made some new friends at court with the aid of the king, inviting noble ladies who were old friends to an intimate dinner one night, and Jeanne soon became close to Madame de Flavécourt and the Maréchal de Mirepoix. But despite her hedonism, Jeanne had a kind heart. Her sponsor, Madame de Berne, was friends with the elderly Comte and Comtesse de Lucin, who had been evicted from their home by gambling debts. The Comtesse had shot dead a police officer and a bailiff while resisting, and so now they were both condemned to be beheaded. Jeanne knelt before the king and pleaded mercy on their behalf, stating that she would not rise until they were pardoned. Louis was overwhelmed and agreed to pardon them, stating, "Madame, I am delighted that the first favour you should ask of me should be an act of mercy." Jeanne was also visited by a Monsieur Mandeville, who asked for her help in pardoning a young girl who had been charged with infanticide for giving birth to a stillborn baby but not telling the authorities. Madame du Barry wrote to the Chancellor of France and was again successful in her request. But in her new position at court, Jeanne soon also made enemies. The Duchesse de Gramont, sister to the Duc de Choiseul, had wanted the position of the king's mistress for herself until Madame du Barry turned up. Both she and her brother went so far as to anonymously finance gutter pamphlets slandering both Jeanne and Louis XV. But Madame du Barry's power at court grew as Choiseul's waned. Against the king's wishes, Choiseul decided to side with Spain against Britain for possession of the Falkland Islands. When the du Barrys found out, Jeanne brought this plot to Louis's attention, and Choiseul was dismissed from his position on Christmas Eve 1771. It was proof that a young girl of common blood with no head for politics could still be a dangerous adversary if she had the king's ear. However, despite her kindly nature and patronage of the arts, she was unpopular with the people due to her extravagant spending. Even though the king gave her a huge monthly income, she was still often in debt. And there were still those at court who ignored her, most notably Marie Antoinette. After complaining of this to the king then advised the Austrian ambassador, who in turn spoke with Marie Antoinette and asked her to speak with Madame du Barry. Eventually, on New Year's Day 1772, the Dauphin stood near Madame du Barry and casually said, "There are many people at Versailles today," giving her the option to respond or not. It was enough to please Jeanne. Most of the ways in which she was treated and the later portrayal of her character were based either on snobbery from above or jealousy from below. She had put herself in a place few would feel comfortable in, a common girl in the position of a noblewoman in 18th century France. But although Madame du Barry had some happy years by the king's side, they were not to last. In 1774, Louis XV grew ill and took to his sickbed. His 3 daughters stayed by his side in the daytime and Jeanne by nighttime. Louis grew weaker, and when efforts to revive him did not work, the doctors had to admit to their king that he had contracted smallpox. Jeanne bravely decided to stay by his side. This was no small matter for a woman whose entire livelihood depended on the beauty of her face, risking a disease which, if she survived, could scar her permanently. But on the 4th of May, Louis suggested to Madame du Barry that she had to leave Versailles, both to keep herself safe and to allow him to prepare for the last rites. She was relieved of her duties and placed under the protection of the Duc d'Aiguillon, who offered to take her to his castle at Rieux. Jeanne left the room calmly, but fainted once outside and had to be carried to her apartments, where she spent the night in tears. In the morning, she left in a hired carriage so as not to arouse the crowds outside. The king later asked for her, and upon hearing she had already left, stated, "What? Already?" and tears fell down his face. Whatever the courtiers of Versailles may have thought, there was a deep affection between the pair. King Louis XV died on the 10th of May. His successor, his grandson Louis XVI, was persuaded to banish Madame du Barry to the Abbaye de Pompadour, a convent. At first, she was intensely disliked by the nuns, who knew in their midst was a mistress of the king who had little regard for their religious way of life. But it wasn't long before Jeanne's charm and good nature warmed them to her, and she soon settled in, as she had at all new turns of her life. After a year of living at the convent, she was granted allowance to visit the surrounding countryside, but to be back by evening. Just a month later, she was allowed to go further, but not to travel more than 10 miles towards Versailles. Finally, after 2 years, she was permitted to return to her beloved Château de Lourcienne, a chateau that had been given to her by Louis XV and was close to Versailles. She lived there for many years, having a few liaisons with new lovers, such as the Duc de Brissac, who later would have his head thrown through her window during the French Revolution. Madame du Barry's connection with the French Revolution came first with her slave Zamore. In 1792, she discovered he had joined the Jacobin Club, an important political club for the Revolutionaries. Jeanne was horrified and immediately demanded he hand in his notice and leave her service. It was a bad move. Zamore did as she asked, and then went and denounced his mistress to the Committee of Public Safety. Based on his testimony, Madame du Barry was suspected of funding émigrés who were fleeing the revolution, but she wasn't arrested immediately. She continued to live at her chateau, much as she had before, taking perfumed baths and having her hair done every morning. Less and less of her friends were around, some in exile, others in hiding, and nobles who had once rejected her were now glad to be invited to her dinner parties. But things took a darker turn in 1793 when the Revolutionary Tribunal of Paris accused her of treason and she was condemned to death. In an attempt to save her life, Madame du Barry gave details of jewels she had hidden in England. A few years before, when the terror started, she had been robbed and the jewels were found in England along with the thieves. Rather than bring them back to France with her, Madame du Barry travelled to London to identify her gems, but left them behind on her return. Unfortunately, it was these travels between England and France that left doubt on her statement that she was not working with English spies. The confession did nothing to change her fate, but her jewels would later be taken and sold after her death. After being kept in prison for more than 2 months, on the 8th of December 1793, Madame du Barry was led to the guillotine at the Place de la Révolution. Throughout her life, Madame du Barry had kept an easy composure whenever things got tough, but this now abandoned her. Frightened by her fate, she collapsed in the cart taking her to the Place de la Révolution, crying out, "You are going to hurt me! Why?" She screamed and begged for mercy from the watching crowd, but none came forward to help her. The final moments of a woman who had been a hedonist, but a kind and generous one, a woman who set out only to better herself in the only way she was able from her station in 18th century France, were ones held in terror. Upon arriving at the guillotine, she is said to have uttered to the executioner, "One more moment, Mr. Executioner, I beg you." It did no good, and her head was separated from her body. Her remains, like so many victims of the terror, were buried in the Madeleine Cemetery. Madame du Barry was, and still often is, popularly seen as a scandalous harlot, a woman who was little more than a prostitute working her way up to the most royal of beds. But in the context of her time, Jeanne can actually be seen as a girl making the most of what she was able to use. At a time where few women were allowed to own a business alone, be an artist, or hold a position of power, she found that her easy charms and beauty were a key to providing herself and her family with a life of luxury barred to those who were not nobility. While she was accused of being a spy for England helping French nobles escape, it's unlikely she was actually guilty of the charges against her, but her decadent spending and lavish lifestyle drew the attention of a populace rightly frustrated and angry with a monarchy that appeared not to care if they starved in the streets, and her connection to Louis XV made her part of that world. Madame du Barry may be remembered as many things, but it is worth remembering that the scandalous harlot of Versailles was also a kind woman, a faithful daughter who supported her mother and stepfather to the end, and a woman who brought joy to an aging man. Her only crime was to want a better life for herself. When Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were arrested by the Revolutionaries, few openly admitted to being a friend of the king or queen, except for one of Marie Antoinette's most loyal companions. The Princess de Lamballe, Marie-Thérèse Louise of Savoy, was not only a close confidant of the French queen, but would remain so steadfast it would result in her horrific death. Marie-Thérèse Louise of Savoy was born on the 8th of September 1749 in Turin at the Palazzo Carignano. The palace was created for the princes of Carignano, of which the fourth one was her father, Louis Victor. Her mother was Landgravine Christine of Hesse-Rheinfels-Rotenburg, a German princess of the blood. Little is known of Marie-Thérèse's childhood, but silence usually means a contented and uneventful one. She was one of 8 children, herself the 5th daughter. From what is known of the Carignano household, it was fairly typical of most noble families. Marie-Thérèse would have been educated in the qualities deemed most important for a noble wife, as she would one day become, including learning an instrument, dancing, and probably at least one other language. When Marie-Thérèse was 17 years old, she was married by proxy to Louis Alexandre de Bourbon-Penthièvre, the Prince de Lamballe, and a great-grandson of Louis XIV. It was seen as a very suitable match, as both Marie-Therese and Louis-Alexandre were from a royal bloodline, and it allowed an alliance between the House of Savoy and the House of Bourbon. Her brother stood in for her absent husband in the royal chapel of her father's palace, and was followed by a bedding ceremony, in which her brother removed one shoe and one stocking before lying next to her on a bed, both otherwise clothed in front of onlookers, and a wedding feast afterwards. This ensured, even if Marie-Therese's new husband died before she ever laid eyes on him, she would be entitled to her widow's finances. On the 24th of January, she went over the bridge of Beauvoisin between Savoy and France, leaving behind her Italian retinue and life, and becoming the French Princesse de Lamballe. She was escorted to her new husband and father-in-law, to whom she would become very close in later years, and adopted the French version of her name. Just a few days later, as was customary, she was presented at the French court of Versailles. All reports state that she was favourably received. Everyone was delighted with her sweet and merry personality. At first her marriage was happy, as both parties were attracted to one another from the moment they laid eyes on one another. However, the Prince de Lamballe's father, Louis de Bourbon, Duc du Penthièvre, had been desperate to arrange the marriage in order to stem his son's appetites for loose women and raucous behaviour. Predictably, marriage did not stop this part of Louis-Alexandre's personality, and it wasn't long before he was unfaithful to his new bride, having affairs with 2 comedy actresses, and even attempting to give some of his wife's diamonds as a gift to one of them. Marie-Therese was heartbroken when she found out, but she was comforted by her father-in-law, who was the opposite of his son in many ways and saw her as his own daughter. Just a year later, in 1768, Marie-Therese would become a young widow. Having run off from his household once more to pursue a life of drink, women and debauchery, Louis-Alexandre was brought home by his father to the Château de Lucienne. He was suffering from a venereal disease, and despite being nursed by his sister and still loving wife, he died on the 6th of May. Marie-Therese was now a widow and inherited a fortune which made her a wealthy woman in her own right. However, it was her initial wish to enter a convent and become a nun, and she only changed her mind about this when her father-in-law begged her to stay as his daughter. Marie-Therese agreed to stay, instead helping with the Duc de Penthièvre's charitable projects in Rambouillet. He would become known because of this as the King of the Poor, and Marie-Therese earned the nickname the Angel of Penthièvre. Marie-Therese's most well-known role would come in 1770, when the new Dauphin, Marie Antoinette, arrived at Versailles. As Dowager Princess de Lamballe, Marie-Therese was expected to be part of royal ceremonies and to greet the new future Queen of France. During the next year, in 1771, her father-in-law began to entertain more, and as a result of being his hostess, Marie-Therese became more involved in court life, including attending balls held in the name of the Dauphin. Marie Antoinette was reportedly enchanted by Marie-Therese and showed her more attention than the others, which didn't fail to escape the gossips of Versailles. Cousins of Marie-Therese married into Marie Antoinette's family, and it wasn't long before the Dauphin came to treat Marie-Therese as a close relation. The Empress Maria Theresa, Marie Antoinette's mother, disliked the friendship, as she believed royalty should not form close or intimate relationships, and that having favourites caused problems. However, Marie-Therese was known by all for having an amiable and sweet personality, unlikely to create political or courtly problems, and was a princess of the blood. This made her acceptable if such a companion had to be chosen. Marie Antoinette was charmed by her new friend, and Marie-Therese became her closest confidant. After Marie Antoinette's young husband Louis XVI had ascended to the throne, also making her Queen of France, she raised the station of her friend. On the 18th of September 1775, Marie Antoinette made Marie-Therese the superintendent of the Queen's household, the highest possible rank for a lady-in-waiting. This position meant Marie-Therese was now in charge of overseeing the Queen's orders, staff, and schedule over all other ladies-in-waiting. But the very giving of this position created tension. The post had been vacant for over 30 years, mostly because it was seen as unnecessary, expensive, and gave too much power to the holder. This was compounded when the Queen also gave two of Marie-Therese's brothers lucrative posts. Marie-Therese was of sufficient rank, but was seen as too young. She would also gain the outrageously huge salary of around 1.2 million livres. Marie-Therese was asked, in the circumstances of the country, if she would give up at least part of this huge sum, but she refused, bursting into tears and stating she would rather have all the honours that came with her rank or retire from court. Marie Antoinette instead offered to pay the salary, leading to whispers of Marie-Therese being a greedy court favourite. Marie-Therese was also given to fainting spells and convulsions, sometimes remaining unconscious for hours at a time, which gave way to rumours that these were fake and used to bring on sympathy. In other words, whatever good reputation Marie-Therese had built for herself by helping charitable works was being eroded in her behaviour and perceived favouritism at Versailles. Marie-Therese had many charms. She was described as charming and sincere, unlikely to engage in the intrigues of Versailles, and was liked by nearly all at court. However, she was also reclusive by nature and preferred to spend time with the Queen in small groups of company, rather than in the high society balls and amusements that Marie Antoinette was coming to enjoy as she settled into her role as Queen. It wasn't long before Marie-Therese would be pushed aside for a new favourite, Yolande de Polastron, the Duchesse de Polignac. Yolande was beautiful, outgoing and sociable, and she expressed her opinion to the Queen that the Princesse de Lamballe was rather boring. In return, Marie-Therese considered the Duchesse de Polignac to be a bad influence on Marie Antoinette and distanced herself from Yolande. By 1776, Marie Antoinette was spending more time with her new favourite, and Marie-Therese appeared less and less at court. The Queen quarrelled more with the Princesse de Lamballe, who always seemed to be in the wrong, reported by Ambassador Mercy to the Empress Maria Theresa. When Marie Antoinette decided to arrange amateur theatre productions at her personal property, the Petit Trianon, Yolande managed to convince the Queen to refuse Marie-Therese's admission to them. It must have been a humiliating experience for Marie-Therese, who was still superintendent to the Queen's household. As such, she still had to hold balls in the Queen's honour, greet foreign royal guests with the Queen, and participate in ceremonies, such as for the birth of the royal children. By the mid-1780s, Marie-Therese's health had worsened to the point she was no longer able to perform her duties. In 1787, she travelled to England, advised by her doctors to take the waters in Bath. Despite the medical nature of her visit, rumours abounded that it was actually a secret diplomatic mission on behalf of the Queen. Charles Alexandre de Colonne, an exiled minister of France, was about to publish his memoirs, and some thought Marie-Therese was going to ask him to omit details about the Queen, but in fact, he was not in England at the time. But this still showed the story that was growing around Marie Antoinette and those deemed close to her, even if the rumours were foundless. After her return to France, Marie-Therese found that the Queen's friendship with the Duchesse de Polignac had soured, and once again became Marie Antoinette's closest confidant. Her health had recovered to the point Marie-Therese could once again join in with court life, but events outside Versailles were brewing as well. She would have been present in 1789 to attend the ceremonies around the opening of the Estates General, an important point in the build-up to the revolution. Propaganda surrounding the king and queen was gaining speed as well, and several pamphlets a week were spilled onto the streets of Paris. Marie-Therese was reserved and quiet by nature, and regarded by many at court as something of a prude, but that didn't prevent the production of pamphlets accusing the Princesse de Lamballe from being a lover of Marie Antoinette. This tapped not only into the growing hatred of the wealth divide and for the upper classes, but also into the 18th century suspicion of homosexuality. The main purpose was actually to undermine the Queen's image, but it must have been horrible for Marie-Therese to be shown in this way. In July 1789, when the French Revolution finally broke with the storming of the Bastille, Marie-Therese was away in Switzerland, and when she returned, she stayed in the country to nurse the Duc de Penthièvre, and so was not present for the Women's March on Versailles on the 5th of October. 2 days later, Marie-Therese left to join the royal family in the Tuileries Palace, resuming her duties as before, sharing the apartments of the Pavillon de Flore with Madame Elizabeth, the king's sister. Marie-Therese settled fairly permanently. It would prove to be a brave decision, but was in keeping with her loyalty and steadfastness. Life in the Tuileries Palace retained some sense of normality. King Louis XVI still held public viewings of his rising and going to bed, and Marie Antoinette still held card parties and dined publicly with the king, whilst also attending mass. Foreign envoys were still admitted and had to be entertained. Throughout all of this, Madame Therese was by her queen's side. She had never really enjoyed holding lavish parties or balls, but now she threw herself into them. She understood that gaining support of loyal nobles would be the key to helping Marie Antoinette's cause. Her salon became the meeting place for the Queen and many important members of the National Constituent Assembly, as well as where Marie Antoinette reportedly met with Mirabeau. In light of the revolution, Marie-Therese also had a new role to take on, that of checking for loyalty amongst the royal household. Madame Campan, Marie Antoinette's lady's maid, recalled how she was questioned by the Princesse de Lamballe after rumours she had been receiving revolutionaries in her rooms. Through a network of spies, Marie-Therese cleared Madame Campan, then questioning the lady's maid on other members of the household once she knew she could be trusted. Many members of the court fled France, including the one-time favourite of the Queen, the Duchesse de Polignac. With so few members of the royal entourage remaining, slander against them intensified, amongst them Marie-Therese. In June 1791, the royal family attempted to flee France in the unsuccessful flight to Varennes. Marie-Therese was not aware of it at first, probably to protect her from being questioned afterwards if it had been successful. But the night before, Marie Antoinette simply bade her good night and advised her to spend a few days in the country for her health. After departing the next day for her villa in Passy, the Princesse de Lamballe received a note from the Queen, informing her of the escape plan and asking her to meet them in Brussels. Obtaining letters of introduction, Marie-Therese set out at once, first sailing to Dover in England and travelling through the Netherlands until she reached Brussels, meeting with Count Axel von Fersen, the Queen's close friend who was behind the details of the plan. Of course, she then knew the escape hadn't worked. In doubt for some time whether she would be more used to the Queen in or out of France, Marie-Therese's mind was made up for her in October 1791. This was when the new provisions of the Constitution began, and Marie Antoinette was told to put her household in order and release any courtiers not in her service. The Queen therefore wrote the Princesse de Lamballe a formal letter asking her to either return to service or resign. While we do not know the contents of this letter, it apparently was enough to convince Marie-Therese her place was by Marie Antoinette's side, and she made up her mind to return to Paris. She was quoted as saying, "I must live and die with her." This also led to Marie-Therese writing her will, although there is some dispute whether she wrote it in Britain or while in the Netherlands. In either case, she understood there was a good chance she would die in the Queen's service. On her return to the Tuileries Palace, Marie-Therese wrote to nobles who had already fled France, asking them to return in the Queen's name. She worked hard at retaining loyal courtiers around the royal family. When the demonstration of the 20th of June 1792 broke out, Marie-Therese was with the Queen at the Tuileries. The demonstration was the Parisian people's last attempt at a somewhat peaceful resolution to persuade Louis XVI to abandon his current policies. The people of Paris burst in as a mob, intending to petition the king in his apartments and obtain decrees and ministers they deemed fit. But they also passed by the room in which Marie Antoinette was with her children. The Queen, fearing for her husband, cried out, "My place is by the king's side!" But Marie-Therese calmed her friend and replied, "No, no, madame, your place is with your children." A table was pulled before the Queen and her 2 children, and she was protectively surrounded by her ladies-in-waiting, the children's governess, and a few noblemen. They stood by her side as the mob passed through for several hours, spitting and hurling insults at Marie Antoinette as they went. According to a witness, Marie-Therese stood by the Queen's side through the whole ordeal, showing great bravery as she placed herself between the mob and the royal family. Her only thoughts seemed to be with keeping Marie Antoinette, the young Dauphin Louis, and his sister, also named Marie-Therese, all safe, without giving her own safety a second thought. The Princess de Lamballe would remain in the Queen's service even during the much more violent attack on the Tuileries Palace on the 10th of August, 1792. The palace was stormed by armed revolutionaries, and Marie-Therese, along with the children's governess Madame de Tourzel, took refuge with the royal family in the Legislative Assembly. This attack would prompt France to abolish the monarchy just a few weeks later. While staying at the Legislative Assembly, Marie-Therese grew ill and had to be sent away to the Feuillante convent to get better. Marie Antoinette told her loyal friend not to return, but as soon as her health improved, Marie-Therese once again returned to the royal family, travelling with them to the Temple, a prison tower that once stood in Paris. It was clear she had made her choice about living or dying. On the 19th of August, it was to be the last time Marie-Therese would ever see Marie Antoinette or her family. The Princesse de Lamballe, along with Madame de Tourzel and her daughter Pauline de Tourzel, was separated from the royal family and taken to La Force prison, where the 3 women shared a cell. In September, the prison was attacked several times by mobs, and those accused would be placed before hastily assembled tribunals run by the common people. Each prisoner was questioned before ultimately being allowed to go free or being condemned to death. Death came in the form of being thrown out to a yard where a mob of men, women and children were waiting to kill the condemned. The staff of the prison didn't agree with this and often allowed prisoners to escape, especially women. Pauline de Tourzel managed to escape, but her mother and Marie-Therese were too famous to get out safely. However, the royal governess Madame de Tourzel, along with most of the other women who had been members of the royal household, were freed from all charges. Sadly, the Princesse de Lamballe, her profile too well known, the slander against her forming an opinion in the minds of many that didn't really exist, would be the exception. On the 3rd of September 1792, Marie-Therese and Madame de Tourzel were brought out into a courtyard before a people's tribunal. She had spent several weeks in a small, dank cell, unknowing of her fate, and it must have been terrifying to face the accusatory people waiting for them outside. The roars of the crowd outside the courtyard were loud and angry, and the experience must have been nightmarish. The Princesse de Lamballe was quickly asked her name and her employment, before being questioned as to whether she knew of court plots on the 10th of August. Upon replying that she did not, Marie-Thérèse was then asked to swear to a very specific oath, that of liberty and equality, but also to swear hatred to the king and queen. Reportedly, her words in response were, "Readily to the former, but I cannot to the latter. It is not in my heart." There were some men who were sent from her father-in-law present, and they apparently whispered to her to say the oath, even if she didn't really mean it. But Marie-Thérèse instead simply added out loud, "I have nothing more to say. It is indifferent to me if I die a little earlier or later. I have made the sacrifice of my life." It was the end of her swift interrogation. The judge announced that Madame was to be taken away, meaning death. The Princesse de Lamballe was marched out of the courtyard by two sans-culottes and thrown out into the yard beyond, where a murderous self-proclaimed executioner mob awaited her. The yard was already filled with the bloodied corpses of other prisoners who had met the same fate, and the men sent from her father-in-law shouted out for mercy, but were soon silenced when the mob shouted for their deaths also. Apparently, the Princesse de Lamballe stood silent for a moment, a small woman dressed in white, before she was struck with a pike to the head and fell to the ground. The crowd then set upon her, stabbing her viciously until she bled to death. There are many variations on her death, especially later from pro-royalist supporters criticising the regime, in which Marie-Thérèse was stripped naked and raped, or had her breasts cut off, her body cut apart and her entrails dragged out. However, there is no historical proof for these tales of horror, and were more likely used as propaganda against the murderers when on trial in later years. A clerk, who later had to deal with the remains of Marie-Thérèse's body, noted only that her pockets had items in, suggesting she was still fully clothed, and that she was without a head. This part was true, and furthers the grisly death of the Princesse de Lamballe. Her head was removed from her body and mounted on a pike, then paraded through the streets, while her body was dragged behind as the crowd screamed, "La Lamballe! La Lamballe!" There were several witnesses to this, and one purchased a lock of her hair which was later given to her father-in-law. Marie-Thérèse's head was then shown beneath Marie Antoinette's window at the Temple prison. The wife of one of the prison officials saw the head and screamed. Thinking the scream came from Marie Antoinette herself, the crowd laughed and jeered, asking the Queen to come and kiss the lips of her favourite. The prison officials kept the royal family away from the windows, and Marie Antoinette apparently fainted upon hearing whose head was outside. One of the Duc de Penthièvre's men managed to get hold of the Princesse de Lamballe's head, interring it in a nearby cemetery. Her body, while recovered by the authorities, was not buried in a known place and is still unknown today. Marie-Thérèse, the Princesse de Lamballe, may have been on the wrong side of history in siding with the French royal family, but that is her only fault. She appears to have been a charitable, gentle person who was loyal to her friends to the very end, and brave enough to face her fate. There is no question that while the grievances of the French people had been ignored for too long, and their suffering should have been helped a lot earlier, Marie-Thérèse and her fellow prisoners did not deserve the horrifying death that awaited them. Her character lived on in the memoirs of those who had known her, and while not a prominent part of the French Revolution, she would be remembered as another whose blood was spilt for being close to Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI in the building of the new republic. There were many rumours spread about Marie Antoinette in the simmering tension before the French Revolution, but none as damaging as the affair of the diamond necklace. Between 1784 and 1785, the French Queen's name would be further dragged through the mud for apparently committing fraud. The story begins in 1772, when Louis XV was besotted with his young and beautiful mistress, Madame du Barry. She enjoyed living a life of luxury and all the trappings that went with it, so the king had decided to create a special gift for her, a necklace of such grandeur and expense that even his wife, Queen Maria, had nothing like it. Louis called upon two of Europe's most renowned jewellers, Charles Baumer and Paul Bassenge, to create it for him. The design agreed upon would come to an astounding 2 million livres, around $15.1 million today. Something as ornate and grand as this piece of jewellery couldn't be made and paid for in the week, however. It would take months for the two jewellers to gather the precious diamonds and pearls needed. They also weren't paid a large enough down payment, meaning that each time they had to pay for another handful of gems, Baumer and Bassenge had to save up for the next batch and get further into debt. But as the monarch of France was footing the bill, they were certain they would be paid for their work. They came up with an elaborate design of pendants, festoons and tassels, using only the highest quality diamonds they could get their hands on. The necklace ended up with around 674 stones, adding up to over 2,800 carats. It was described as a row of 17 glorious diamonds, as large almost as filberts, a 3-wreathed festoon and pendants enough encircle it, around a very queen of diamonds. Unfortunately, in 1774, 2 years after they had begun work on the necklace, Louis XV died from smallpox. Madame du Barry was banished from court by his successor and grandson Louis XVI, and so by the time the grand piece of jewellery was finished, its original intended owner was no longer in a position to wear it. Baumer and Bassenge were left with angry creditors and an ostentatious necklace that no other royal in Europe would touch with a large barge pole. So in 1778, the two jewellers approached the new king, Louis XVI. Their plan was to sell the necklace to the young king's Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette. Louis offered it to Marie Antoinette as a gift, but she refused. As beautiful as the necklace was, the queen turned it down and compared it to a horse's harness, stating, "We have more need of 74s than of necklaces." A 74 was a French gunship, and the quote shows that the queen understood, unlike her reputation for selfish decadence, that there were more important things to spend 2 million livres on. Some did whisper that Marie Antoinette also turned it down because it had been created for Madame du Barry, who she disliked intensely for being a mistress and a commoner who had found herself by the side of the king. But Baumer and Bassenge didn't give up easily, and after being turned down by other European royals, again tried to sell it to the French queen in 1781, after the birth of her son Louis Joseph. Yet again, the desperate jewellers were turned down. Unfortunately for Marie Antoinette, someone else had been watching events with great interest and formulating a plan that would make them rich and further sully the Queen's tarnished reputation. Jeanne de Valois-Saint-Remy. She was born on the 22nd of July 1756 in Fontaine to a poverty-stricken family. However, her father, Jacques de Valois, would swear blind to anyone listening that they were in fact nobility, descended from an illegitimate son of King Henri II and Nicole de Savigny, his mistress. Jeanne's father was an alcoholic who lived off others, and her mother was Marie Jossel, a servant girl. 3 of Jeanne's siblings died as young children, but she had a brother and sister who survived alongside her. Jacques, who was older, and Marianne, who was younger. Both of her parents were neglectful and abusive. The children often had few clothes, went barefoot, and were forced to beg for food. Jeanne's mother would make her children go out onto the streets crying out, "Pity a poor orphan of the blood of the Valois." Luckily for Jeanne, her fortune soon changed. While still a young girl, the family moved to Boulogne, where somehow the children caught the attention of Madame de Boulogne-Villiers. De Boulogne-Villiers was a kindly elder woman who decided to help take care of the children, and with the help of a genealogist from Versailles, confirmed the royal ancestry of Jeanne's family. This then allowed a petition for a small royal pension for the 3 children. Certain legal procedures were set up to allow aid for the children of impoverished nobility, and this allowed Jacques, Marie and Jeanne to receive a stipend each year, as well as an education. While Jacques attended a military academy, the girls went to a boarding school at Passy. Jeanne and her sister were intended to become nuns in the Longchamp monastery, but both instead opted to leave and return to normal life. Jeanne was a charming young woman, and it wasn't long before she had gained herself a husband. On the 6th of June 1780, Jeanne was married to Nicolas de la Motte, an officer of the gendarmes. Whether it was true love or not is not recorded, but Jeanne was heavily pregnant on her wedding day. Just a month later, on the 7th of July, her newborn twins were christened, 2 boys named Jean-Baptiste and Nicolas Marc de la Motte. However, sadly, they died just a few days later, and Jeanne would not have any more children. It wasn't long before the newlyweds took to calling themselves Comte and Comtesse de la Motte Valois, on the basis of Jeanne's flimsy connection as a member of the nobility. However, Jeanne wanted the lifestyle that would match her grandiose new title, and it soon became clear that wouldn't happen on an officer's salary. Deciding that her drops of royal blood were the key, Jeanne resolved to ask the royal family for a larger pension, specifically Marie Antoinette. During the 18th century, anyone dressed reasonably well and behaving themselves could not only enter the Palace of Versailles, but even catch a glimpse of the royal family themselves. Jeanne hoped that Marie Antoinette and herself would find common ground on the basis of both being female, but unfortunately, the Queen refused to meet with her. As seen with her dislike of Madame du Barry, Marie Antoinette was not a fan of women who resided outside the usual relationship of being a faithful married woman, and she had heard of Jeanne's loose lifestyle. Not long had passed before Jeanne and her husband Nicolas had realised married life wasn't for them, but they continued to live together. Jeanne took a lover, a fellow officer of her husband's, known as Rétaux de Valette. Marie Antoinette had heard the rumours of this relationship and had no interest in associating herself with Jeanne as a result. The public already had mixed feelings about the Queen. Sometime in 1783, Jeanne met the Cardinal Louis de Rohan. The Cardinal de Rohan was a cadet of the Rohan family, son of the Duke of Montbazon and Bishop of Strasbourg, but his lifestyle was anything but religious. Aside from enjoying the luxury and fashionable people of the Parisian nobility, de Rohan was known for sleeping with women despite his religious vows, and had a desire to become a politician. But his attempts to break into the court of Versailles had been thwarted. This was due to making an enemy of himself to Empress Maria Theresa when he had been part of a palace cabal opposed to the French-Austrian alliance cemented by the marriage of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. As a result, the French Queen wasn't very impressed with him either. De Rohan desperately wanted to redeem himself in Marie Antoinette's eyes, knowing it would help him greatly at court and hopefully allow him a position as one of the king's ministers. Jeanne saw an opportunity to improve her situation through this man and it wasn't long before she became de Rohan's mistress in March 1785. This allowed her to know him better and learn of his desire to win over Marie Antoinette for his own ends. De Rohan was a man desperate to improve his position, and Jeanne was desperate to improve her finances. She was an attractive woman and charming, and Jeanne was able to obtain some money from her new lover, as well as a new position for her husband in the Comte d'Artois' bodyguard. Abbé Georgel, de Rohan's servant, described Jeanne as having the wiles of Circe, the magical enchantress of the ancient world, presented as a predatory female. Jeanne wore the most fashionable outfits she could afford, and spread rumours that she was actually on good speaking terms with Marie Antoinette, and that the two women were close. She even created the illusion further by making an arrangement with the gatekeeper at Marie Antoinette's personal house, Le Petit Trianon. Jeanne would wait just inside the gates in the evenings until courtiers went by, before leaving through the gate, seemingly fresh from a personal meeting with the Queen. Her act was a triumph. Not only did the Cardinal de Rohan fall hook, line and sinker for her lies about being close to Marie Antoinette, but others also paid Jeanne to pass messages to the Queen on their behalf. Soon, Jeanne was earning a good income from her rumours. Hearing of Jeanne delivering notes, it wasn't long before the Cardinal asked her to pass on his personal message to the Queen. She, of course, accepted. Her plan was put into action, but she didn't do it alone. In order for de Rohan to fall for what she had planned, Jeanne needed to provide replies from Marie Antoinette. Her lover, Rétaux de Villette, was also an amateur forger and was all too willing to become an accomplice. A correspondence began between de Rohan and who he thought was Marie Antoinette, but was in fact de Villette's handwriting with Jeanne dictating. The tone of the letters was initially cool, to replicate Marie Antoinette's real dislike of the Cardinal, but eventually Jeanne found a way to use it to her advantage. One of the fake letters, supposedly from the Queen, stated that if de Rohan would make 2 payments of 60,000 livres for her to pass on to her charitable works, she would forget the animosity she held towards him. De Rohan gladly handed over the money, despite being somewhat strapped financially himself, and Jeanne quietly pocketed the money. But the Cardinal was no longer content with only the written word, and as the language in the letters grew warmer towards him, he pressed for an actual meeting in person. Anyone else might have decided to end the pretend relationship there and then, having made some money and moved on. But Jeanne de la Motte did not give up that easily, and she was determined to make the fake Queen meet the infatuated Cardinal. Sending de Villette out into the seedier streets of Paris, she told him to find a prostitute that could resemble Marie Antoinette. He succeeded in his task, securing the services of Marie-Nicole Leguy, who agreed to do the job for a mere 15,000 livres. A secret nighttime rendezvous was set up in August 1784 with the Cardinal and the woman he believed to be Marie Antoinette to meet in the gardens of the Palace of Versailles. Nicole Leguy stepped out from within the bushes, wearing a dress copied from a portrait of the Queen, her face obscured with a black veil. In order to maintain the fraud, she wasn't to speak many words, but she handed de Rohan a rose and supposedly whispered, "You know what this means. You can be sure that the past is forgiven." Before he had a chance to respond further, de Villette, dressed as a servant, and Jeanne appeared and hurried the fake Queen away, apparently concerned her sisters-in-law were around the corner and would see the pair together. Understanding the Queen could suffer no controversy, de Rohan didn't give chase, and the next day received another forged letter. The pretend Marie Antoinette apologising for her sudden departure. But it wasn't long before the supposed friendship between Jeanne and Marie Antoinette reached the ears of Beaume and Bassenge. Still desperate to be rid of the glittering weight around their necks, they contacted Jeanne to see if she could help them offload it to the Queen. She leapt at the opportunity, but stated that she wanted to do the transaction through her own company and earn a commission. The jewellers agreed, happy for the chance to be rid of the necklace. Jeanne already had a patsy to help her with the scheme, the Cardinal de Rohan. He received more letters supposedly from Marie Antoinette, never seeming to catch on that they were signed Marie Antoinette of France. As a son of nobility, he should have known that royalty only signed with their first names, but perhaps his eagerness to be on good terms with the Queen made de Rohan overlook this. He finally received a letter that was to create the largest fraud of 18th century French history. It asked him to help with a delicate matter. The Queen, of course Jeanne dictating to de Valette, wanted to buy the diamond necklace, but did not wish to do so publicly, as people were struggling to pay for essentials. Fake Marie Antoinette asked if he would purchase the necklace on her behalf, arrange for payments to be made in instalments, and that she would repay him the funds in secret, as well as promising lucrative favours for him at court. Apparently besotted with Marie Antoinette, despite initially hesitating over the huge sums of money involved, de Rohan met with the jewellers in January 1785. It is possible he may have met with his spiritual advisor, Count Alessandro di Cagliostro, a charlatan really named Giuseppe Balsamo, who had been paid off by Jeanne to pretend to have a divine vision that the cardinal would receive nothing but good fortune if he helped the Queen in this endeavour. Whether this really happened or not is not known, as later no evidence could be found to involve Cagliostro. Either way, de Rohan settled with himself that purchasing the necklace was the way forward, and he set up terms with Beaume and Bassenge, showing the two jewellers the letters from Marie Antoinette, as well as the terms supposedly written in her hand. It was enough. They handed the necklace over, and de Rohan took it swiftly to Jeanne's home. She was careful to hand it over in front of him to de Valette, who the cardinal still thought of as Marie Antoinette's servant. Once de Rohan had left, Valette returned. The three criminals, Jeanne, de Valette and her husband Nicholas, immediately set about picking the necklace apart into pieces, prizing each gemstone free of its setting. Nicholas travelled to London to find buyers for the most difficult jewels, and his two accomplices sold what was left in the black markets of Paris. However, time was not on their side. Jeanne tried to cool de Rohan off until August, when the first instalment of the repayments was due, but suspicions were already being raised. Marie Antoinette still hadn't been seen wearing the necklace in public, and while knowledge of buying such a necklace would have created scandal, wearing it would have probably gone unnoticed amongst her other jewellery. Beaume finally smelt a rat, and he went to Henriette Campan, the Queen's lady-in-waiting, telling her all that had happened. It was obvious that something terrible had been committed in the Queen's name, and Campan confirmed for Beaume that he had been swindled. She told Marie Antoinette immediately. The fraud had been discovered. The crime went from the private to the public in dramatic fashion. De Rohan was first questioned vigorously by Louis XVI on the 15th of August 1785, before being arrested outside the king's apartments in the Gallery of Mirrors. Stunned members of the aristocracy watched as the cardinal was dragged off to the Bastille. He was able to send a note to his estate, ordering the destruction of his correspondence with the fake Marie Antoinette. When Jeanne found out about his imprisonment, she immediately raced home to do exactly the same, burning all evidence of the crime. But 3 days later, she too was arrested. It wasn't long before de Villette, who admitted his forgery, and the prostitute Le Guy joined them in the Bastille. The only one to escape immediate consequences was Jeanne's husband Nicholas, who was still in London attempting to sell some of their ill-gotten gains. Of course, Jeanne would make every attempt to save herself, and she implicated Cagliostro, trying to pin him as the mastermind of the plot. He was locked up with all the rest. Cardinal de Rohan, as a noble, was offered the choice of a private hearing before the king or appear before the Parlement of Paris. Knowing Louis XVI was furious about the smearing of his wife's name, and also that Parliament often went against the king, de Rohan chose Parliament. Pope Pius VI was furious, as he believed only he should be the judge of what de Rohan had done. No detail was missed out in the trial, and the public relished hearing the intimate details of the fraudulent crime. De Rohan, along with Le Guy, who appeared with a baby at court having given birth in the Bastille, and Cagliostro, was acquitted, but there was still the question of whether he had committed treason in his actions which had damaged the Queen's reputation. The judges agreed he was merely an innocent idiot, but nobility was still expected to know the signature of the Queen. He was found not guilty of treason, much to Marie Antoinette's disgust. She was horrified when she found out the finer details, such as the supposed nighttime tryst with the rose, and the Queen was unable to see how stupid the Cardinal could have been. Aside from an incorrect signature, the forged letters looked nothing like her own handwriting. The images these events stirred up in the public image would be permanently damaging for the Queen. Even though she had been ignorant of the whole affair, ugly whispers began that surely she must have had a hand in the plot. De Villette admitted his whole part in the scheme and gave so much information on his accomplices that he was merely banished from France. Nicolas de la Motte was tried in absentia and sentenced to working as a galley slave, but as he was still hiding in London, nothing actually happened to him. Jeanne was not so lucky. Quite rightly seen as the mastermind of the plot, she was sentenced to be whipped, branded with a V on each shoulder for volus, meaning thief, and given life imprisonment at the prostitutes' prison at Salpêtrière. The only person whose name was involved with the scandal to be completely declared innocent and unknowing of all events was Marie Antoinette. And the story might have ended there, with the criminals locked away, except the public, who had been privy to the details of the trial, made up their own version. Although the Queen had been found completely blameless in the crime, the public wanted to believe the overly extravagant Marie Antoinette was in fact the mastermind behind it all. Rumours began that she had used Jeanne to purchase the necklace for her, making her middlewoman look like the main culprit. They decided it had been done to gain vengeance on the Cardinal de Rohan. Everyone knew of the Queen's hatred for him. No one questioned why the letters didn't match her handwriting, or why the necklace had disappeared, or even why de Villette had admitted everything. They simply wanted to think of the Queen they despised as guilty, and Jeanne used this for her own ends. What compounded this was the Queen's disappointment at de Rohan being acquitted, Louis XVI exiling him to the Abbey of l'Archesse-Dieu, and the fact that Parliament's acquittal was seen as an implication that Marie Antoinette had been involved. Knowing most of the public now amazingly believed she was innocent, Jeanne escaped from prison within the year with the aid of her supporters, dressing up as a boy and simply walking out onto the street. The jewel thief fled to London, to join her husband and the remaining gems. Marie Antoinette's reputation, however, suffered badly. Despite the fact she had rejected the necklace when offered it and had been proven innocent, the public now viewed her as a greedy spendthrift who would rather buy jewels than look after her country. Her early spending when a teenage bride had already sullied the way common people viewed her, and they simply saw the events as more of the same, even if it had never actually happened. There was an eruption of literature satirizing or outright defaming the Queen. Pamphlets appeared showing the Queen having sex with the Cardinal, or Jeanne and Villette having sex. Some even claimed de Rohan was the father of some of the royal children. Marie Antoinette's public appearances grew less in number until they were almost non-existent, and both Louis and herself retreated further into their own safe bubble at Versailles. While the affair of the diamond necklace wasn't the main cause of the revolution, it was certainly the kindling which sprang into flame from the public's anger. This was all made even worse when in 1789, Jeanne de la Motte, safe in London, published her Mémoire justificatif de la Comtesse de Valois de la Motte. It attempted to justify her own actions in the crime of the diamond necklace, while also fueling hatred against Marie Antoinette by outright lying and casting blame on the Queen. She admitted only to being the Cardinal's mistress. It would seem that the criminals and duped accomplices got away with the crime, while the innocent French Queen bore the brunt of it. De Rohan lived fairly quietly in exile, but was later elected to sit in the Estates General, later the National Assembly. He was popular, but resigned when he refused to take the oath to the civil constitution of the clergy, instead leaving for the German part of his diocese, Ettenheim. He spent what money he had left on poverty-stricken priests who had to leave France as well. Nicole Leguy, after a brief stint in which she published her own memoirs about her part in the affair, simply disappeared back into the shadowy pages of history and was never heard from again. She died at the age of 28 in 1789 while staying at the Fontenay-sous-Bois convent. Rétaux de Villette moved to Italy, never to return to his native France, and also wrote a book about his adventures in the affair of the diamond necklace, publishing it in Venice in 1790. It is thought he then lived out the rest of his life in poverty, dying in 1797 at the age of 43. Nicolas de la Motte, Jeanne's husband, remained in London until after the French Revolution. He then returned to Paris, living without his name reappearing in any scandal, and dying on the 6th of November 1831. He was the only accomplice of the crime to escape any punishment at all. Marie Antoinette's battered reputation, along with that of her husband's, was their downfall. Not long after the affair of the diamond necklace, the royal family was placed under house arrest in 1792, and in October of 1793, the Queen of France would be brought up on charges of high treason, conspiracy against the state, sending money to Austria, and even the horrific and untrue charge of incest with her son. On the 16th of October 1793, Marie Antoinette was led out in a cart for the hour-long journey to the Place de la Révolution, where a guillotine had been erected, and was beheaded. Her body would be tossed into an unmarked grave at the Madeleine Cemetery until it was exhumed during the Bourbon Restoration in 1815 and reburied with her husband's remains at the Basilica of Saint-Denis. But what of Jeanne, the mastermind behind the affair of the diamond necklace, who escaped punishment by fleeing to London? Everything falls somewhat quiet after the publication of her memoir, but it would seem that selling a famous necklace's gems on the black market gave her less money than it was actually worth, as soon she had gained debt. Jeanne always wanted a lavish lifestyle, and it's likely she and her husband soon blew through whatever cash they made from the crime they committed. In 1791, while Marie Antoinette was under house arrest, Jeanne jumped out of her hotel room window to escape debt collectors. The Times newspaper reported that she did not survive the fall, being found terribly mangled, her left eye cut out, one of her arms and both her legs are broken. Jeanne de la Motte died on the 23rd of August 1791, coming to a sticky end as a result of her desire for an extravagant lifestyle. But she left behind her a tattered and chaotic wake, playing her part in the downfall of the French monarchy through her actions, and helping cause the personal downfall of Marie Antoinette. The only real escapees of the affair were the diamonds themselves, which disappeared into shadowy hands and have never resurfaced. On the 13th of July 1793, the revolutionary and Jacobin leader Jean-Paul Marat was assassinated as he lay in his bathtub. This was shocking enough for the citizens of Paris, but more than this, that the murder had been carried out by a woman, a minor noblewoman from Caen. That woman was Charlotte Corday. Her full name was Marie-Anne Charlotte de Corday d'Aumont, and she was born on the 27th of July in 1768 in Saint-Saturnin-de-Lignery in Normandy. She was born into a minor aristocratic family. This meant that while they were not as affluent as the higher nobility, they would still have lived comfortably and probably owned local lands. Her father had a short military career before returning home and marrying his cousin. They would have 3 daughters, of which Charlotte was the second. Sadly, when she was still young, her elder sister and mother died. Unable to cope with looking after 2 young daughters alone, their father sent them for their education to the Abbaye aux Dames convent in Caen. The French crown had a special fund for impoverished families of minor nobility, and this allowed the 2 girls to receive an education suitable for young aristocratic ladies. It was also where Charlotte was introduced to the writings of Plutarch, Rousseau and Voltaire in the convent's library. These would shape and influence her thinking and personality, and was the beginning of her ideas about politics in society. When Charlotte came of age in February 1791, she left the convent to live with her aunt, who also resided in Caen, Madame Le Costelier de Bretteville-Gouville. The 2 women became close, and Charlotte would later become the heir to her aunt's estate. It was at this time Charlotte also began to read Corneille, her great-great-grandfather and renowned playwright, and began to see in herself many of the qualities of Corneille's heroines, of being virtuous and courageous. Charlotte also admired many of the Enlightenment philosophers, likening their ideas to those of the Greek democracy. Madame Le Costelier was an ardent royalist, whereas her niece felt the royals were nice people, but not suited for the job. While in Caen, Charlotte would have seen the extreme poverty and famine that plagued the poor of France, even in her rural area. The ordinary people of France were desperate by this point, and the only way they could change anything was to beg for assistance. By September 1792, events reached a crisis point, and the September massacres took place. These were a series of killings that took place between the 2nd and the 6th of September. Charlotte was horrified by the unbridled violence and lost one of her friends, Wajagao de Mangret. The September massacres were a violent reaction to the prisoners who had been rounded up by the surveillance committee set up by the Jacobins. The prisoners included anyone who represented counter-revolutionary activities, including priests, nobles, and anyone connected with the royal family, such as the Princesse de Lamballe, famously one of the first victims. This was presented as a response for the revolutionaries who died in the storming of the Tuileries on the 10th of August 1792, but was likely also a cold and calculated plan that was born of the fury people felt for their problems being ignored for so long. Jean-Paul Marat was the first to suggest organising groups of prisoners to be massacred, working alongside his Committee of Surveillance of the Commune to round up around 4,000 people. After rejecting plans, also suggested by Marat, to burn large groups of them alive, it was instead the suggestion of Bilal Varenne to butcher them. After the massacres, a circular was published asking all patriotic French in rural areas to rise up to defend their country against the coming Prussian threat. But before taking up arms and leaving their homes, it was suggested they rid themselves of all counter-revolutionaries. The violence in Caen was very likely to have been connected to this. We don't know if this was the trigger for Charlotte, but on the 9th of July 1793, she set off on a one-way trip to Paris. She was carrying a copy of Plutarch's Parallel Lives, a book intended to showcase virtues alongside failings. The hidden nature of her visit started with Charlotte telling her father that she was in fact taking a trip to England. She took a room at Hôtel de Providence, already planning the murder of Marat. Jean-Paul Marat had risen through the ranks of the revolutionaries through his political ideas. Long before he was part of the Jacobins, Marat had written works criticising elements of the British Constitution when he lived in Newcastle upon Tyne in England, and on prison reform. He moved back to France studying medicine and science. Giving up a career as a scientist and doctor when the French Revolution started, Marat instead became a journalist, writing on behalf of the ordinary citizens of France. On the 12th of September 1789, Marat began his own newspaper, originally titled Publiciste Parisien, before changing it just a few days later to L'Ami du Peuple, or The Friend of the People. Marat used his paper to criticise the most important people or groups who were working against, as he saw it, the revolution. In 1790, he attacked Jacques Necker, Louis XVI's popular finance minister, and was nearly arrested for it. Other people began to copy his paper, forcing him to call on the police to catch the fraudsters, leaving him as the only voice of the friend of the people. Marat also poured venom on the revolutionary leaders he didn't feel were going far enough, urging for more extreme action against the monarchy. Marat only became publicly known on the 10th of August with the storming of the Tuileries. Marat's Committee of Surveillance of the Commune published the circular that called for the rounding up and killing of counter-revolutionary enemies of France. While Marat's actual part in the massacres that came next is debatable, certainly he and his committee took control of what was already happening. At least Charlotte personally believed Marat was to blame for the way the revolution was going, and she had decided that killing him was the only way to prevent further bloodshed. She also believed it would prevent an all-out civil war, and that Marat was threatening the delicate beginnings of the Republic. From her room in the Hôtel de Providence, Charlotte wrote out her Address to the French, Friends of Law and Peace. This was a document which outlined her reasons for assassinating Marat, and her hopes for the peace that would follow his death. Her original plan was to kill Marat in front of the National Convention, the Constituent Assembly of France from the creation of its first republic. Her aim was to make an example of him, but she soon found out this wasn't going to be possible. Marat suffered from a severe skin condition, which was possibly dermatitis herpetiformis, an autoimmune condition that blisters the skin in response to celiac disease. His health was deteriorating due to this condition, and he now rarely went out, conducting most of his business with other people from a bathtub. Charlotte changed her plans accordingly. Her mood towards Marat was probably worsened still by his latest achievement, in helping the downfall of the Girondins on the 2nd of June. As a sympathiser of the Girondins, it was probably just more fuel for the fury that Charlotte felt. However, although it probably would have done little to prevent Charlotte taking the path she did, Marat was now actually far less important than she had given him credit for. With the Girondins now out of the way, the Montagnards, namely Robespierre and others leading the group, no longer needed Marat or the Jacobins' support. They began to distance themselves, and most of his letters to the National Convention were ignored. On the 13th of July, sometime in the morning, Charlotte made her way to Marat's home with a plan. The day was stiflingly hot, and she would have passed citizens sipping cool lemonade, as well as tricolour ribbons and emblems decorating pillars and doorways. She stopped along the way to purchase a new hat, replacing her white bonnet for a black one with green ribbons. With this act, she would unknowingly make green the colour that represented counter-revolutionary activities. Then, Charlotte made her way to a cutler's shop, purchasing a large 5-inch long kitchen knife, which she slipped unseen into her corset. Marat was known to allow in anyone who offered help or information for the revolution, and Charlotte decided to play on this. Charlotte's nervousness is shown, however, through the fact that it was almost midday by the time she reached his door. She might have walked the streets for a while, building up her nerves to do the deed. The door was answered by his sister-in-law, Catherine Evra. Marat was married to Simone Evra in a common-law marriage when he was 49 and she was 26. Catherine was immediately suspicious of Charlotte, who claimed to have the names of several Girondists in Cannes who were planning an uprising. Not certain about the woman at her brother-in-law's door, Catherine sent her away. Undeterred, Charlotte simply returned that evening around 7 p.m, and this time she gained entry. Her arrival coincided with the bread and newspapers delivery, and so Charlotte gained entrance up the stairs without knocking. Simone, Marat's wife, stopped Charlotte on the stairs and questioned her, as she was uncertain about Charlotte as her sister had been. The would-be assassin raised her voice so that Marat could hear her, stating she had information, and so Marat shouted down that she should be let in. It's likely her promise of information of a Girondin uprising was important to Marat due to his diminishing importance. If he could show the Girondins was still a threat, he might still be valuable as support against them. Charlotte was granted an audience with Marat as he took his medicinal bath, a board laid over the top of the bathtub to form a desk. It's not hard to imagine how unassuming Charlotte must have appeared. Women would not have been considered as assassins, spies perhaps, or messengers, but not murderers for a political cause. She sat down and the interview took place, lasting around 15 minutes or so. This was due to Simone being present at the interview, until Marat asked her to go and fetch some more kaolin solution for his bath. Marat asked Charlotte what had happened in Cannes, and Charlotte probably told him at least some of the truth. But then she claimed to have a list of Girondists who were planning to rise up in retaliation for what had happened in Paris. He wrote the names down and Charlotte embellished them with invented details. Finally, Marat finished writing his list and declared, "Their heads will fall within a fortnight." Charlotte later changed this statement at her trial to, "Soon I shall have them all guillotined in Paris." At the moment Simone left to fetch the solution for the bath, Charlotte stood up from her chair, pulled out the long kitchen knife from within her corset, and stabbed it into Marat's chest. Her blade went under his right clavicle, opening the brachiocephalic artery close to his heart. The bleeding was instant and fast, and it's likely Marat died within minutes. He cried out to Simone, "Aidez-moi, ma chère amie! Help me, my love!" and slumped backwards, dying almost instantly. Simone rushed into the room, followed by one of Marat's colleagues from the Friend of the People. Simone cried out, "My God, he has been assassinated!" looking over at Charlotte and adding, "Marie-Rousse, what have you done?" The colleague threw a chair at Charlotte and held her down. Roused by the yelling and screaming from Marat's apartment, neighbours piled in, including a military surgeon and a dentist. They tried to revive Marat, but unsurprisingly, to no avail. Charlotte had succeeded in killing her target. Charlotte was surprisingly impassive. She appeared to have no urge to get away and seemed only to want to explain her motives for the crime. To the local commissaire de police, a man named Goulard, Charlotte said, having seen that civil war was on the point of exploding throughout France and persuaded that Marat was the principal author of this disaster, she had wished to sacrifice her life for her country. 6 further officials came to the apartment to poke about and investigate, and to these, Charlotte confirmed she indeed came from Caen, but to their disappointment that the idea was hers alone. The officials preferred the idea that the assassination had been planned by a group of Girondists, and the truth that Charlotte, a woman, had planned this on her own seemed absurd to them. News of Marat's death spread quickly, and the crowds of Saint-Germain were nearly hysterical for Charlotte's blood. The officials had great difficulty from stopping the crowd from tearing her apart on the spot, only calming them by reminding them that they would be unable to find out any of the others they believed were part of the crime if Charlotte was killed. She was taken to the Abbaye prison, into a small cell with a straw mattress. She wrote a letter to the Convention, protesting against the rumoured arrest of Claude Fauchet, a Girondin deputy and constitutional bishop of Caen. It was hinted that they had been in partnership, and Charlotte stressed that not only had they never spoken, but that she found Fauchet a fanatic with no firmness of character, and she didn't respect him at all. Many times throughout the investigation, Charlotte would stress how the idea that a woman was incapable of what she had done had played to her advantage, and she was proud to prove that women were in fact capable of patriotic violence. Charlotte underwent 3 separate cross-examinations, each with the intent of establishing that she was part of a wider Girondist conspiracy. With the strength of truth on her side, Charlotte denied these allegations, holding to the fact she had planned it alone. She stated that Marat was, in her opinion, a hoarder and a monster, and that she had killed one man to save 100,000. When asked if she had practiced the killing blow, Charlotte became visibly upset, protesting she was no murderer, and that it had simply been luck killing Marat with one stroke. Charlotte also insisted not only was she a Republican, but she had been one even before the Revolution, citing examples from ancient Rome and Greece. The president of the Revolutionary Tribunal, Motte, who conducted 2 of her examinations, asked Charlotte, "Do you think you have killed all the Marat?" Charlotte answered steadily, "With this one dead, the others, perhaps, will be afraid." She was convicted and condemned to death and was transferred to the conciergerie to await her execution. While there, she was permitted to write 2 letters. One was to Charles Barbaroux, a politician and Girondin, stating her hope that more patriots would follow her example. The second letter was to her father, in which she begged his forgiveness for doing away with her life without his permission. She also asked him and her family to be happy, as she had died for a greater cause, and that she felt she had saved many lives. The morning of her execution, Charlotte asked if she could have her portrait painted. During the case, she had noticed a young National Guard officer, Jean-Jacques Hauer, sketching her likeness, and she was given permission for him to complete it into a painting. Hauer entered her cell and completed the portrait in 2 hours, with Charlotte only interrupting to make suggestions. The portrait shows her with blonde hair, despite many other contemporary portraits showing her with brunette hair and her passport describing her hair as chestnut. It was important for Howard that he presented Charlotte as a vain aristocrat and counter-revolutionary, and so he made it look in the painting as though she had taken time to powder her hair, lightening it. When sitter and artist were interrupted by the executioner, Charlotte took a pair of scissors and snipped off a lock of her hair, offering it to Howard as a souvenir of a poor dying woman. It was early evening on the 17th of July 1793, and Charlotte entered the tumbril that would take her to the place of execution alone, refusing the services of a priest. She didn't even sit down, instead choosing to stand and balance herself by resting her knees against the wooden seat. A large crowd had gathered to see her die, and her red shirt, worn to show she was an assassin of representatives of the people, was soaked through as a sudden summer storm passed overhead. Charlotte was calm as she was led to the guillotine. She died quietly, her head separated from her body. Before anyone in the crowd could react, a man named Legros, a carpenter who had been hired to make repairs to the guillotine, picked up Charlotte's head from the basket below and slapped her cheek. Despite what Charlotte had done, the offence against a woman who had just been executed was deemed horrendous, and Legros spent 3 months in prison for it. An autopsy was also planned for after her death, to prove that she was not a virgin. What does that have to do with an assassination, right? Well, they wanted to prove that Charlotte had been sleeping with someone who helped her plan the death of Marat, and they were sorely disappointed when it was proven she was in fact a virgin. She was finally buried in the Chapelle Expiatoire in the 8th arrondissement of Paris. However, her wish that the bloodiness of the revolution be halted never happened. In fact, it grew worse. In the wake of his death, although in life he had been dwindling in importance, Marat became a glorified figure, a man who had given his life for the Republic. Drawing upon the drama of it all, artist Jacques-Louis David was asked to design an elaborate and grand funeral, and also to create a painting that would do Marat justice. Marat's cadaver was already rotting in the intense midsummer heat, and so the embalmers had to work quickly, placing his body into the pose David deemed necessary. It was said that the arm that holds the iron pen in the painting, a symbol of his tireless work for the Republic and its citizens, had to be replaced with the arm from another body due to a fracture. There was horror one morning when it was found to have fallen off to the floor, and his wound had to be partially stitched up so as not to create too much revulsion for the viewer. David's final image of Marat portrayed him as a wounded hero of the revolution, tirelessly working for the people in the grand posture of an ancient Roman, spilling his blood only for France. His funeral was attended by the entire National Convention, and he was buried in the garden of the former Club des Cordeliers. An exhibition was set up in the church there beforehand to show his body to devotees, including Marat's writings, and Marat himself was placed on a bed lined with tricolour banners and ribbons, a circle of flowers on his brow. Also shown was his unusual shoe-shaped bath, his bloody robe, and his desk. In the elegy for his funeral, Marat was likened to Jesus for loving the people and hating kings, nobles, priests, and rogues. If it seemed somewhat cult-like, Marat did indeed become a cult-like figure in the days to come. When the Jacobins began to do away with religion, instead replacing it with the cult of reason and cult of supreme being, Marat was viewed as something like a saint, his bust often replacing crucifixes. On the 19th of November, the port city of Le Havre de Grace would change its name to Le Havre Marat, and Montmartre became Montmarat. A bronze sculpture of him was created and placed in Parc des Buttes-Chaumont. Charlotte Corday's act, far from diminishing Marat, had only made him shine brighter. The terror would also grow in intensity after Marat's death. His assassination was a powerful piece of propaganda for the Jacobin revolutionaries. His death proved, it seemed, that the revolutionary dictatorship Marat had emphasized had to be put in place, and to follow his ideas, however extreme, were the mark of purity for the Republic. It wouldn't be until after the Thermidorian reaction that Marat's reputation would crumble, his glorified death no longer needed after the fall of Robespierre. As for Charlotte, even if she was not successful in her ultimate goal through assassinating Marat, she changed views on the position of women politically. Her killing was considered masculine, but she had proven that a woman was capable of forming her own ideas about the Republic, of planning a political murder, and of actually doing it alone. Female revolutionaries distanced themselves from Charlotte, fearful that her act would jeopardize their growing feminist movement. Those who agreed with what she had done wrote poems about her in glowing terms, some of them being arrested after her death. As late as 1847, Alphonse de Lamartine wrote his Histoire des Girondines and dedicated part of the series to her, giving her the nickname the Angel of Assassination. Regardless of how successful Charlotte was in her endeavour, or how she was regarded, it cannot be denied that she changed the way women were viewed in their personal agency and in the strength of their own convictions. One of the most well-known mistresses in French history, Madame de Pompadour, is best known for her role as Louis XV's lover. But how did she get there? How did an ordinary girl from a common family rise to become not only a royal mistress, but one of the king's most trusted political advisors, even after their affair ended? Madame de Pompadour started out life in Paris, born on the 29th of December 1721, with the name Jeanne Antoinette Poisson. Her parents were François Poisson, a supplier for the army, and his wife, Louise Madeleine de la Motte, a perfectly ordinary middle-class family who were doing well for themselves. And she would have a baby brother come along in 1725 by the name of Abel François. However, there were persistent rumours that Jeanne's father was actually a man called Charles-François Paul Lenormand de Tournay, a financier and tax collector for the king. However, many of these rumours about Jeanne's mother came later when her enemies wished to blacken her name, and we have no reliable way of knowing if they are actually true or not. These rumours worsened when Jeanne was around 4 or 5 years old when her father Francois was caught up in a scandal regarding fraud and debts. At the time, he was food commissioner, and Paris was going through the famine of 1725, and it's likely the two events were linked. As the crime was punishable with death, Francois fled the country in 1726, and would not return until 10 years later when he was cleared of all charges. During this time, Tournay became Jeanne's legal guardian. Louise Madeleine had to leave the comfortable family home and move into more modest accommodation on the Rue du Bon Enfant, but she was a strong woman with good connections. Her example was no doubt a show to her young daughter of how a woman could be resilient and ambitious even in the 18th century. Both parents, however, were certain their daughter should be settled. It was decided Jeanne should be sent to a convent, the one at the Dominican Priory at Poissy, with the nuns dedicated to Saint Ursula. One of Francois's cousins was there, Sister Elizabeth, and one of Madeleine's sisters, Sister Perpetua, to keep an eye on her. Poissy was also the birthplace of Louis IX of France, and as such it became one of the centres for his cult. In the 14th century, the castle had been demolished to make way for the priory to be built, and there were even royal quarters built on, so that there was somewhere for the king to stay when coming through. Many of the nuns were also daughters of nobility who could claim descent from Louis IX. So not only was Jeanne about to receive one of the best educations young French girls could only dream of, but she was also in a place surrounded by royal propaganda and pomp. But when she was around 9 years old, Jeanne was taken ill with whooping cough and sent home to her mother, who nursed her back to health. She had, by all accounts, enjoyed her time at the convent, and letters from her aunts reveal she was often taken out to visit the surrounding town with her cousin, and she seems to have felt settled. But things were about to change. There is a story that around this time, Louise Madeleine took her daughter to a then famous fortune teller, Madame Le Bon. The fortune teller, looking into her crystal ball, or perhaps Jeanne's palm, or perhaps even the tea leaves, saw something that would change young Jeanne's destiny forever. The fortune teller stated that young Jeanne would one day rule over the heart of a king. This led to Jeanne earning the nickname Reine, meaning Little Queen. From that moment forwards, Louise Madeleine now decided to raise her daughter to become a royal mistress. Once again, Tourneham came financially into the picture and paid for Jeanne to have private tutors at home. Not only was he reputed to be her natural father, but he was also a childless widower, so it's not hard to imagine he was charmed by little Jeanne and the possibilities for her sparkling future ahead. However, by the time Jeanne was 15, her father Francois Poisson had returned from exile in Germany. She must have barely known him, and he probably didn't quite fit in the new cultured world her mother was creating for her, but Jeanne nevertheless wholeheartedly embraced her father once more into her heart, always calling him her dear father. Whether or not Jeanne had some doubts over her parentage, she never showed them. While her brother Abel Francois was educated at Louis le Grand by the Jesuits, Jeanne was taught singing by the operatic tenor Pierre Géliot. The actor Jean-Baptiste Lenou taught her elocution, and she learned dancing, conversation, and to play the harpsichord. This was a young girl being groomed for a very particular future. At the age of 19, now a charming, accomplished, cultivated, beautiful young woman with soft brown hair, eyes somewhere between blue and grey and a svelte figure, Jeanne was ready for marriage. And while she had worthwhile traits for a member of the nobility to attract a duke or even a prince, Jeanne had to cast her net a little lower. As it turned out, Tourneham already had the perfect man for her husband, and it was a move that makes it even more possible Jeanne was indeed his daughter. Charles Guillaume Lenormand was Tourneham's only nephew, the son of his far less successful brother Hervé Guillaume, and Tourneham had been arranging his future for some time. He was made a junior partner, following his uncle in also becoming a tax farmer. In December 1740, Tourneham then made Charles his sole heir, disregarding all other nieces and nephews. And then he suggested him as a husband for Jeanne. On the 4th of March 1741, the marriage contract was signed between them, but Charles' father refused to attend, only too aware of how his son was being used. Poor Charles was obliging but shy and very hopelessly in love with his new wife, and Tourneham also gifted them his estate, of Etiolais, when they were officially married a few days later on the 9th, moving in with Tournéhem at the Forest Side estate. It wasn't long after her marriage that Jeanne fell pregnant with her first child. However, her health, ever fragile, became a cause for concern once more. In September, she wrote a letter to her father asking him not to worry about her, but also stating that she had had 2 fevers during her pregnancy. In December 1741, she gave birth to a little boy, but he had died by the early part of the following year. In 1742, Jeanne also began to involve herself in the salons of Paris, creating her own at Etiolais. A salon at that time was a gathering held by a host, with the aim to both educate and entertain. Many wealthier or more connected women held their own salons, amongst them Madame Geoffrin, who Jeanne was smart enough to flatter the daughter of in conversation, Madame Dauphin, who held an opulent court at the Hôtel Lamballe, but it was Madame de la Popelinière who she saw as her real rival, a woman who was lover to the Duc de Richelieu, and hosted Voltaire and the artists Van Loo and Latour, amongst many others. Jeanne could not compete with the sophisticated elegance of the Parisian salons just yet, instead having to be content with the countryside beauty of Etiolais. Jeanne had not only learned well in music and dancing, but also reportedly had a beautiful singing voice, and she understood how to put these talents to good use. She requested a theatre be built at Etiolais, which was, of course, immediately put in place, no one ever able to say no to her. In the summers, crowds of young duchesses, elderly artists and writers, and young dashing men would gather to Etiolais to watch plays and comedies performed, almost always with Jeanne in the lead role. They would read aloud to one another in the summer evenings. But the real excitement came in August, when the king arrived at his nearby estate of Choisy. The king liked to hunt in the nearby forest of Sénart, and it's highly likely he had already heard of the vivacious young Jeanne and her salons by 1742. Voltaire later wrote that Jeanne had always been assured of her destiny in meeting the king, and she took advantage of his closeness in the summer. She would ride through the forest in a sporty little carriage known as a phaeton, wearing her most striking and lovely gowns, trying to catch his eye. It worked, and Louis often sent her a present of wild venison he had caught while out on a hunt. For his part, Louis XV was in his prime, a handsome and cultured king at the age of 32. But he was also shy and awkward in social situations, often choosing to duck out of difficult talks even when it involved political or military duty. He had been married at 15 to the Polish princess Maria Leszczyńska, 7 years his senior, and at first had been devoted to her. He had 10 children with her by this point, 7 of whom would survive to adulthood. Not that he was a particularly good father, barely noticing when his 4 younger daughters were sent to a convent at extremely young ages, or when one of his older daughters, Elizabeth, left for Madrid to marry Philippe, Duke of Parma, a son of the Spanish King Philippe V. He wasn't really very interested in family life, but now he turned to mistresses, seeming to enjoy the secretive diversions of them from more important courtly matters. In 1744, on the 10th of August, Jeanne would give birth to her second child, a daughter named Alexandrine Jeanne. The little girl would be doted on by her family, but especially her grandfather Francois, as noted in a later letter by Jeanne, who jokingly lamented at how grandparents spoil their grandchildren. The little girl was given the affectionate nickname Fan-Fan. On the 8th of December 1744, the king's current mistress, who had been briefly sent from court, Marianne de Mailly, died in her bed at the age of just 27. It was suspected poisoning by her enemies. highlighting the dangers of annoying the wrong people as a royal mistress, but it nonetheless left a vacancy. After May's death, the king, who had also within a few years lost one of his daughters, his mother figure governess from his childhood, and Cardinal de Fleury, his father figure who had ruled with royal assent for many years, was lonely and despondent. France was involved with Charles Edward Stuart, the Jacobite pretender, otherwise known to history as Bonnie Prince Charlie, and they were gearing up for another attempted landing in Scotland. Everyone needed Louis to cheer up and want victory, and the only way they knew how to achieve that from him was to get him a pretty woman who would help get him back to normal. While we're not completely sure when the first time the king was fully introduced to Jeanne is, there were reports in early 1745 that Louis had been seen at 2 masquerade balls, dancing with an unknown beautiful woman. On the 24th of February, Jeanne received a formal invitation to a ball the following night at Versailles, which was to celebrate the marriage of the Dauphin Louis to Infanta Maria Theresa of Spain. The young couple came through to the crowd in the Hall of Mirrors, the Dauphin dressed as a gardener and Maria as a flower seller, followed by 8 large and moving yew trees made of papier-mâché. These yew trees were in fact disguised courtiers, and the king was amongst them. As soon as they entered, the ladies of the court descended on them, knowing one of them was a royal. But it was Jeanne who caught the king's eye, and the two never left each other's side that night. It was their first public sighting together. More sightings of them followed over the next 2 months at more balls and seen together at the ballet and theatre, in separate boxes but still in view of each other. While much of the nobility accepted the king was enjoying a dalliance with one of Paris's most attractive women, none of them could accept the idea she would become something more. The idea of the king taking a mistress from the bourgeoisie was simply unthinkable. But by March 1745, Jeanne had been installed in the small suite of rooms at Versailles that Madame de May had once occupied. A bedroom, a small sitting room, and a reception room, all close to the king's petit cabinet, his studies, libraries and drawing rooms, where Jeanne would also meet his inner circle at dinner parties. On the 7th of May, the official separation of Jeanne and her poor husband Charles was announced. One can only hope he found happiness elsewhere. By June, she was declared as one of Louis's official mistresses, as his maîtresse en titre. It went down like a lead balloon with most of the courtiers, but it was obvious that the pair were actually in love. Jeanne, having won her shot, made sure she threw everything at flirting and seducing the king, and Louis would no doubt have been bowled over by the elegant, entertaining woman who was now so familiar and publicly romantic towards him. But there was a rule that no mistress of the king could be without a title, something that would be repeated many years later with Madame du Barry. On the 24th of June, Louis gave Jeanne the title, coat of arms, and estate of the Marquisate of Pompadour, making her the Marquise. She was now officially the title known to most people, the Marquise du Pompadour or Madame du Pompadour. A few months later, on the 14th of September, Jeanne was formally presented to the king at court. She wore the customary black robe de cour, an elaborate gown with her jewels, face rouged up as all court ladies should be, and looking as elegant as ever. She curtsied before the king, murmured a few words. The king nodded at her with unhidden embarrassment at the whole spectacle, and she did the requisite 3 curtsies before walking out backwards carefully. Jeanne was then taken through to the Queen's rooms, and everyone held their breath for what would be said. But Queen Maria was not daunted, and she spoke to Jeanne about a mutual acquaintance of theirs without batting an eyelid. Understanding how important it was to keep the queen on side, Jeanne immediately responded with how much she respected Maria and assuring her of her loyalty to please Her Majesty. Maria seemed pleased enough with this, and in future years she would often favour Jeanne over the king's other mistresses. But one person would not be present to see Jeanne's rising star at court: her mother, Louise Madeleine. At the age of just 46, Louise Madeleine fell ill, and on Christmas Eve 1745, she passed away at home. Jeanne went deeply into mourning, secluding herself for the few days allowed before she was required back at court. Jeanne quickly understood that Louis, a shy introvert at heart, preferred the secretive and cosy petit cabinet near her rooms, and set about making these a haven for him. She realised that if it was she that created an amusing, warm and happy place where he could relax with a small group of friends, or indeed just with Jeanne during their intimate moments, she would become indispensable. Without her, the haven would vanish. By May 1746, Louis had to once again disappear on military campaign, but he ensured Jeanne would have a luxurious place to wait for him, buying her the Château de Crécy, southwest of Versailles. She was also pregnant with her first child by the king, but just a few weeks later after his return, Jeanne miscarried. It was a multiple tragedy, as just a short while later on the 22nd of July, the Dauphin Maria had also died while giving birth to her daughter, Marie-Thérèse of France, who would herself die as an infant in 1748. After leaving his family in mourning at Choisy, Louis went to Crécy to mourn in peace with his mistress and a small trusted entourage. Shortly after, attention was turned to obtaining a second wife for the Dauphin, this time a Saxon princess, Maria Josepha of Saxony, suggested by none less than Jeanne herself. Madame de Pompadour would waste no time in cozying up to the new wife, making friends with her and ensuring an ally against her enemies at court, including the Prince du Conti, Louis Armand de Bourbon. Knowing the king's attention could quickly move elsewhere, by January 1747, Jeanne had constructed another theatre in the Petit Cabinet, performing comedies and plays with other ladies of the court to keep the king and his friends amused. The audiences for these were very small, only around 14 at most at a time. Those who wished to be invited into this intimate space with Louis were often left hanging, and it became a matter of importance to be invited into Madame de Pompadour's little society gatherings. In one move, Jeanne both kept Louis interested and elevated her position at court. When the wedding ball was being arranged for the Dauphin's second marriage, it was Jeanne whom the king entrusted to make a list of all the ladies of Paris who needed to attend, as well as being in charge of the decor and other guest lists. No one recorded what the queen thought about all of this, but it was true that Jeanne had her finger on the pulse of who was hot and who was not at the time. But she also did not forget her family. Her father, Francois, became the Seigneur de Vandières, and her brother Abel became Monsieur de Vandières, and would later become the Director General of the King's Buildings as well as Marquis de Marigny. By 1748, not only was Jeanne the most intimate companion of Louis, but his most trusted advisor. She had made allies at court amongst many influential people, to the point that others wanting to be in on the action had to decide to be with her or against her. Even when Louis was away on campaigns, he would often send a courier to Jeanne and awaited her advice on almost everything. She was often attended at her toilette by courtiers both eager for her influence on the king and embarrassed at grovelling to her. She always appeared sweet and eager to help all people around her, no doubt while actually feeling out who was an ally where the weaknesses of someone might be, and ultimately how to place herself above all others. Jeanne was nothing if not clever at playing courtiers at their own game. She also set to work winning over the royal family. She commissioned Nattier, a famous painter of the day, to create a portrait of the king and queen's 3 youngest daughters, still away at the convent. The queen was overwhelmed at the wonderful painting, and arrangements began to be made for the return of the eldest daughter to Versailles off the back of this event. But Jeanne's whirlwind life of parties, late nights, theatre productions and meetings with the king took their toll on her health, and sometime around 1748 she suffered yet another miscarriage. Many courtiers muttered about Jeanne seeming to keep Louis away from more important matters of state, and that she barely allowed him any time to himself. Jeanne, however, truly believed Louis was better when away from his work, and that it was her life's work to amuse and entertain him, but both became exhausted by this punishing regime. By 1749, Jeanne was once again pregnant, which didn't help. But a few months later, she miscarried for the last time, this time with rumours of possibly being poisoned by the Comte de Maurepas, the Minister of the Navy. A poem began doing the rounds at court alluding to Jeanne's inability to maintain a healthy pregnancy, and Maurepas was thought to be the author. Jeanne feared for her life, and she spoke about this with Louis, who dismissed the Comte from court. The nobility was stunned, and it only fueled rumours that the king was enthralled to his mistress. But their affair would eventually end. In 1750, Jeanne's sexual relationship with Louis came to an end, largely in part due to her ill health. Suffering from the effects on her lungs of bronchitis and whooping cough, her 3 miscarriages and a lowered libido, it went hand in hand with Louis in 1751 being forced to renounce his mistresses and repent his sins, as it was a jubilee year. However, Jeanne's position at court remained high, and she simply moved to being the king's friend. Despite not being able to have sex anymore, she was still one of the most trusted people Louis had around him, especially as he preferred familiar faces, and Jeanne could be relied upon to not only tell the truth but also to offer sound advice. She backed this up with a commission from the sculptor Jean-Baptiste Pigalle of herself as friendship or amitié, offering herself humbly to a sculpture of Louis, her hand over her heart. She would continue to be a prominent person at court, and in October 1752, Jeanne would be raised to a duchess, and by this point, she had also been moved to large palatial rooms on the ground floor at Versailles. But her personal life also took blows, starting with Tourneheim's death in 1751. This was followed on the 4th of June 1754 by the death of her only living child, Alexandrine Jeanne, at the convent of the Assumption, where she was receiving an education. Jeanne was unable to get to her daughter in time, and despite Louis himself sending 2 of his own doctors, the little girl was already dead when they arrived. It devastated Pompadour and her father Francois. He also died 11 days later of a broken heart on the 25th of June 1754. Jeanne was now left with just her brother Abel Francois still living, and she retreated into mourning with him. Events around Jeanne, as well as her previous duties, meant that she took on an increasing amount of political duties, such as appointing advancements, offering favours, and contributing advice to both foreign and domestic policy. Essentially, Jeanne played at being Prime Minister. This gave the impression once again that she was in charge and was being despotic with her favourites, but in fact Louis still had final say over everything. In 1755 she was approached by Wenzel Anton, Prince of Kaunitz-Riedberg, an Austrian diplomat. He wanted her to take part in the negotiations which would eventually lead to the Treaty of Versailles and the alliance between France and Austria. This alliance would lead to France's involvement in the 7 Years' War and a loss for France of their American colonies and defeat at the hands of the Prussians. Despite this, Pompadour continued with her support, even though this war would leave France bankrupt and struggling politically in Europe. Jeanne was also responsible for bringing Étienne François de Choiseul, Duke of Choiseul, into office as foreign minister as he allied with her, supporting his policy of suppressing the Jesuits and the 1763 Treaty of Paris, which did formally end the 7 Years' War. In her personal life with the king, it was rumoured Jeanne took part in setting up a harem in a small house within the Parc aux Cerfs. In actual fact, there was no harem, but it was a place the king would meet with a single woman at a time. Still presumably in love with the king, she was jealous of any time he spent with a lover, but hidden away on the grounds of Versailles was better than having to compete with a pretty and clever court favourite. She once stated, "It is his heart I want. All these little girls with no education will not take it from me. I would not be so calm if I saw some pretty woman of the court or the capital trying to conquer it." Jeanne also became a great patron of the arts. She paid for the construction of a porcelain factory at Sèvres in 1759, later buying it outright, and it became one of the most famous porcelain manufacturers in Europe. She also patronised several artists, including Jean-Marc Nattier, François Boucher, Jean-Baptiste Réveillon, and François-Hubert Duret. Jeanne was also responsible, through her building projects and decor at Versailles, for encouraging the Rococo style that became synonymous with France at this time. With the help of Boucher, Jeanne even dabbled in printmaking, creating her own print engravings. She also had a huge library filled with books in both English and French, and she even had some of her own copies of books printed on her own press, as well as collecting others. Louis remained devoted to his former mistress, and this would be proven in 1764 when she fell ill with tuberculosis. The king stayed by her side and helped nurse her himself. Jeanne was only 42 years old, but after a lifetime of hard and fast living coupled with poor health, it was too much. On the 15th of April at around 7:30 in the evening, Jeanne passed away with a stoicism towards her death as she had in life towards most encounters. Her body was taken away on the 17th as Louis watched from a balcony with one of his valets and remarked, "Voilà les seuls devoirs que j'ai pour rendre," or, "Behold, the only respects I can pay her." He turned back into his study with tears on his cheeks, and the body of Madame de Pompadour disappeared into the rain. She was buried at the Couvent du Capucines in Paris, which was destroyed in 1806. Jeanne certainly did everything the fortune teller predicted, and a lot more than that. She came from a normal middle-class family, and there was no reason to assume she would be little more than the wife of a banker, financier, or merchant. But her charm, good looks, and sheer force of will transformed her into a woman who felt her destiny with such surety that she pushed herself not only into the courtly life of Versailles, but made herself the mistress of it all. Her intelligence and political understanding would aid her in winning over the king, and while her advice could be good, later it would also brush a lot of her enemies up the wrong way. But much as with a later mistress of Louis XV, Madame du Barry, many of the nobility were set against Pompadour from the outset. Jeanne wasn't perfect, she had many flaws, but she also had many good points. She was a loving mother, a kind soul who helped reunite the royal family, and a romantic who loved a man deeply and loved the arts. But she was also cold when needed, calculated, and able to spot weakness in someone and exploit it. But in the world in which Jeanne lived, she did what any woman could: aim as high as possible and prove she was capable of being in that place. And no one could argue Madame de Pompadour did not aim high, and she certainly earned her place, both as the king's mistress and friend, and as the undisputed mistress of all Versailles. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.